Chapter 730. A team of 4 like this, even if they were all Realm 6 cultivators, was an execution team that could kill Realm 7 on the battlefield. 4 Realm 7 cultivators, who could form such a perfect killing formation, could kill any enemy Realm 7 on the battlefield. Yet when these 4 killing intents fell towards Ding Ning, Lin Zhujiao and the others on the shore did not show any intentions of attacking. These 4 medicine slaves' opponent was Ding Ning, and Ding Ning was someone no Realm 7 could match. In the past, in Chongling, this kind of attack team was nothing. So at this time, Lin Zhujiao's eyes had a long-lost emotion and a flash of hope. No one had ever had a sword essence as perfect as Wang Jingming's. When he first saw Wang Jingming and saw Wang Jingming attack, he was stunned. In the many battles that followed, watching Wang Jingming fight and his sword forms was an indescribable pleasure for a cultivator like him. Now, he had not seen such a sword attack for many years. The shadows of the shield and spear covered Ding Ning on the white beach and firmly locked onto his presence. These 2 Realm 7 medicine slaves sensed all the minute changes in Ding Ning's body and judged his possible movements. Ding Ning moved at this time. He moved sideways without any finesse and faced the spear that came first. When his body moved, the first to change was the attendant. The water in the world quickly gathered towards the enormous horn bow in his hand. The glowing water droplets contracted from the 2 ends of the bow and gathered between his fingers to form a glowing water arrow. This glowing water arrow rippled with terrifying energy, and the sound of a phoenix rang out in the air. Ding Ning was slightly surprised. He looked up at the horn bow in the medicine slave's hand. With this glance, the medicine slave stilled. He could lock on a Ding Ning's position, but he could not attack. Because Ding Ning was standing in a corner under the shield, a blind spot his arrow could not reach. Ding Ning just moved sideways and moved forward and blocked his attack. Then Ding Ning attacked. It was an unusually simple attack. His life bond presence flooded out of his hand and turned into the Great Punishment Sword. Several wild threads of energy appeared in the air, turned into strange light, and quickly attached to the blade of the Great Punishment Sword. The blade of the Great Punishment Sword seemed to grow thinner and sharper. Then his sword cut the spear that was stabbing at him, and then the shield. The spear broke, and the shield broke. This attack accurately locked onto the energies of the spear and shield without any finesse. The spear tip fell by Ding Ning's side. Ding Ning passed through the shield and brushed past the 2 medicine slaves. His sword swept past, and the heads of the 2 medicine slaves floated into the air. Of the 4 medicine slaves, only 2 were left. The medicine slave with the water arrow at his fingertips did not hesitate. He released the water arrow, and then pulled out the long blade on his back. In his subconscious, Ding Ning was too close to him. At this distance, any minute movement of a cultivator could easily avoid the direct hit of an arrow. However, in his opinion, this arrow could still buy him a certain amount of time. Moreover, there was still a flying sword in front of him that produced countless sword shadows. There was a loud boom. When this arrow shot out, there was no sharp sound as it tore through the air, but a loud boom. The arrow immediately turned into a water dragon that charged towards Ding Ning. The green flying sword fell from the sky. Countless sword shadows mixed together like the feathers of a peacock falling down. Ding Ning looked up slightly. He looked at the countless sword shadows and raised his sword. Amidst the muffled sound of the water dragon breaking through the air, a clear cracking sound rang out. The sky full of sword shadows retreated. At the place where Ding Ning's sword light landed, the green flying sword revealed its true form, turning into 2 broken swords that fell miserably like dragonflies that had been cut off. At the same time, Ding Ning's body brushed past the water dragon. He swung his sword at the medicine slave who had just pulled out the long blade on his back. Rather than a slash, it was more like a stroke. Ding Ning's sword was too smooth and light, and this medicine slave was right at the tip of his sword. This sword gave people the feeling that even if the tip of the sword passed through the body, it would only leave a shallow wound. But the medicine slave, facing Ding Ning's sword, did not feel this way. He felt that the blade in his hand could not stop this sword. With a vibration from deep in his energy sea, his left hand pulled out the short blade at his waist and moved to block Ding Ning's sword. Ding Ning's gaze landed on him. His sword did not change at all. The sword light cut through the gap between the two blades. The medicine slave's body froze. He watched as Ding Ning's sword tip passed through his chest. The tip of the sword left behind a faint red mark. But in the next moment, the red mark hissed, and the sword energy went deeper into his body. His body was cut apart like a thin piece of paper. The last medicine slave was coughing blood. His life-bond sword had been cut in half, and his energy sea was seriously wounded. Ding Ning put away his sword, and his gaze landed on the medicine slave's forehead. A red dot appeared on the medicine slave's forehead. A drop of blood in the air was moved by his sword when he put it away and landed on the medicine slave's forehead. This drop of blood was not powerful, but for a cultivator whose life bond item was destroyed and whose vital energy was still trembling, it was fatal. A soft pop sounded from the back of the medicine slave's head. A mist of blood rose from the back of his head, and then the medicine slave's body fell limply to the ground. Ding Ning stood silently. The corpses of the 4 medicine slaves were scattered around him. Seeing this scene, Lin Jujio sighed emotionally. Even a Realm 7 cultivator appeared weak under such a perfect sword move and seemed no different from a low-level cultivator. In the past, Wang Jingming had been so strong. Or rather, Ding Ning was even stronger now. Lin Jujio, Zhang Shiwu, and Zhang Sun Qinxue came ashore. They followed behind Ding Ning, passing through the white beach and a patch of mangrove forest, and arrived in front of the buildings on the floating island. They couldn't see clearly in the distant white fog, but now they could see that there were 6 rooms standing in front of them, 6 independent huge warehouses. These 6 enormous storehouses were made from dark wood from the sea. The sea wind could not corrode them, but they gave off the scent of time. Each storehouse was enormous, like the nether floats stranded on the island. Chapter 731. The Dangerous Sea, the constantly moving floating island, and the protection of Jieyu and the medicine slaves had isolated Jiaodong Commandery from the world. Other than the masters of each generation of Jiaodong Commandery, or the messengers with the tokens, no one could enter the island and take away the things inside. So these 6 storehouses did not have any formations protecting them, or even chains. The gloomy wooden door, which was as tall as 2 people, was shut quietly. Looking at these 6 enormous storehouses, Zhang Sun Qinshue's heart suddenly sped up. In these centuries, before the old nobility disappeared, Jiaodong Commandery had been called a country bumpkin by the old nobility. But this was just a kind of geographical exclusion, a natural exclusion of outsiders by the deeply rooted nobility who had already taken over Chongling. Any old nobility, including the strongest Chongsun family at the time, had to admit that Jiaodong Commandery, which had struggled to survive after centuries of exclusion, had a unique foundation and accumulated astounding wealth. These 6 storehouses contained the essence that Jiaodong Commandery had accumulated over hundreds of years. A commandery and all the products of the seas that Jiaodong Commandery could reach. In these centuries, a large portion of the things had been consumed in Jiaodong Commandery's struggle to survive. But it was not hard for anyone to imagine that Jiaodong Commandery would not exchange some of the best things for money, and would not give them to the nobility or make some transactions. Some of the most useful parts would be selected and accumulated in these storehouses. If the world was told that the true accumulation of Jiaodong Commandery was in these 6 storehouses, everyone in the world would be extremely curious about these 6 storehouses and want to know what was inside. Zhang Sun Qinxue came from the Chongsun family and knew the wealth of the former Chongsun family's treasury. She also knew that what Jiaodong Commandery accumulated in these storehouses would surpass the Chongsun family's treasury in the past. She, who was usually as cold as snow and did not feel much about foreign objects, was excited because these were Zheng Xiu's things. Zheng Xiu had always been the person she hated the most. Usually, when she heard Zheng Xiu's name, she would feel very unhappy. But now, this feeling was like flipping through Zheng Xiu's treasure chest in broad daylight. Other than pleasure, There was also an inexplicable sense of excitement. She pursed her lips. Just like a young girl, she couldn't help but imagine herself rummaging through Zheng Xiu's boxes one by one in front of her. She would take out the treasures in her boxes and throw them on the ground, but Zheng Xiu would be helpless. Ding Ning walked to the door of the nearest warehouse, took a deep breath, and pushed the door open. He also wanted to know what was in these 6 storerooms. Facing the secret treasure of Jiaodong Commandery, this feeling was like the first time he entered the Bazin Kendo ground and saw the sword hoard in the Bazin Kendo ground. Creak! The heavy wooden door opened with a thud. This storehouse seemed to have not been open for a long time. Some sand and dust had accumulated between the cracks of the door. When the door was pushed open, it sprinkled down like snow. Then, everyone at the door only felt their eyes light up. Or rather, it was a kind of light that was not bright, but it made them feel inexplicably dazzled. "What is this?" Zhang Shiwu frowned and couldn't help but ask. This storeroom was not like what they had imagined, where there were piles of things. Instead, it was exceptionally spacious. Those simple but practical wooden racks were also made of gloomy wood. However, there were only a few wooden racks that had dozens of irregular light blue crystals piled up on them. But as Ding Ning pushed open the door, sunlight fell into the storehouse. When it shone on the wooden shelves started to give off light blue lights. These lights were the source of the dazzling light. These are moonlight fluorites. In the legends of the islands, these are gems formed by moonlight when it falls into the deep sea. But in reality, they are crystals formed by a kind of jellyfish that is buried in the sand of the deep sea after it dies. A special gel in its body naturally transforms into crystals after countless years. That kind of unique jellyfish is very large and will give off a unique light in the deep sea. It is recorded in some books of the islands, but it has gone extinct long ago. So this kind of crystal is very rare. Ding Ning frowned deeply. Zheng Xiu has terracotta soldiers outside her study in the Chongling Imperial Palace. These crystals are recorded in the cultivation world as war figurine crystals, and the source of power for those war figurine formations. A moonlight fluorite the size of a goose egg can support her terracotta soldiers for many years. Lin Zhujiu's expression grew uglier. There are less than 100 terracotta soldiers outside her study. Ding Ning turned to look at him and said, "Yes." The conversation between the two was simple, but Zhang Shiwu and Zhang Sun Qinxue understood the meaning of their conversation. All the cultivators in Chongling knew that on the path outside Zheng Xiu's study, there were statues equivalent to Realm 4 and 5 cultivators. Those statues were made from all kinds of metal and usually did not move. There were soldiers and beasts of different shapes. They looked no different from figurines, but these figurines could sense unusual energy vibrations. If cultivators stepped near Zheng Xiu's study, the formations in these things would activate. Only Zheng Xiu could control these war figurines. This was a unique method of Jiaodong Commandery and was equivalent to the most loyal guards. But there were at most 100 of these war figurines. The number was clear. No matter if it was in the Qin dynasty's war against the Han, Zhao, and Wei dynasties, or in the change in Chongling, or now on the battlefield with the Chu, these war figurines had not appeared. But the light blue light coming from the wooden shells in the storehouse came from the energy of the moonlight fluorites. In other words, while these moonlight fluorites were rare in the cultivation world and hard to find, in the secret storehouse of Jiaodong Commandery, there had once been a large stock. All the wooden shelves in the storehouse had once had these moonlight fluorites. If it was as Ding Ning said, a piece of moonlight fluorite the size of a goose egg could support a terracotta soldier for many years. Then the moonlight fluorite piled up on the wooden shells in front of them could support the hundreds of terracotta soldiers for decades. So while Zheng Xiu must have taken the moonlight fluorite from here to Chongling, if it was just to support the hundreds of terracotta soldiers, she would not have brought such a terrifying amount of moonlight fluorite. Theoretically, Zheng Xiu always had the ability to create large numbers of those terracotta soldiers, but she had always hidden this method and could create but not make them. Those terracotta soldiers are the work of the craftsmen of Jiaodong Commanderies. Zhang Shiwu was very honest, and his question was also very honest. He looked at Ding Ning and asked, "Is it hard to make?" Ding Ning shook his head. Some of the terracotta soldiers only use ordinary gold, and the materials are not rare. Jiaodong Commandery has a complete manufacturing catalog, and each figure has a matching seal formation catalog. It should not be hard to make. If we had not come here, we would not have discovered that she had such a trick up her sleeve. I do not want to see her empty every storehouse here before we came. Lin Zhuzhou's face was cold. He did not look at this room, walked to the second storehouse, and then pushed open the door. A heavy breathing sound came from his nostrils. This storehouse was not empty, and there were many things piled up. Moreover, with a single glance, it was enough to shock and surprise him. Chapter 732. Zhang Sun Qinxue had been angry before. While there were still many moonlight fluorites left in the first storehouse, without the Jiaodong Commandery's terracotta army, it would be troublesome to use these moonlight fluorites for other seal weapons. Also, Zheng Xiu had taken away large amounts of moonlight fluorites, and they would become a powerful weapon against them in the future. But when the storehouse was opened, and she saw what was inside, her anger immediately disappeared. This storehouse was also extremely spacious, extremely neat, and dark wooden shelves. However, these dark wooden shelves were filled with all types of unique utensils. Some of them were specially made jade boxes and jade bottles. Some were porcelain that had been sealed with wax. Some were containers made of even more amazing gems, and many were made of ordinary wood. Lin Zhuzhou, Ding Ning, and Zhang Shiwu all knew the use of these utensils. These utensils with different energies were used to store spirit medicines of different natures to prevent the medicine from losing their effects. Now, most of these utensils were full of all kinds of spirit medicines. So this storehouse was an enormous medicine storehouse. In the past, the Zhang Sun family had a medicine storehouse used to store spirit medicines. But in Zhang Sun Qinxue's memories, the Zhang Sun family's medicine storehouse was just the size of several ordinary houses, and could not compare to this storehouse. Even more importantly, there were many astounding spirit medicines in this storehouse of Jiaodong Commandery. With just a glance, she could tell that there were at least dozens of colorful sea beast cores in the pure crystal bottle, and most of them were the size of a fist. The dense yuan qi was isolated by the crystal bottle, like colorful clouds lingering in the bottle. Just by sensing it from afar, she was sure that it was at least a level 1 spirit medicine of the Flood Dragon Core level. What did this mean? Yi Xiling had been the bureau chief of the Qin dynasty. He had cultivated overseas for almost a decade before he got a serpent core. Ordinary nobles would rarely get a serpent core like this in their lives. In these decades, Jiaodong Commandery had only given a few serpent cores to Chongling. Not all powerful beasts could form Yao cores. Serpents were the same. If she had not seen it with her own eyes, Zhang Sun Qinxue, I would not have thought that Jiaodong Commandery had accumulated so many serpent cores in the past hundreds of years. All kinds of strange beasts, including the Jiao dragons, had different yuan qi properties, but almost all of them could be used to concoct medicines. Some supreme-grade medicines could be directly released with medicine, and the spirit qi inside could be extracted and consumed directly. Some medicines required an apothecary to remove the vital qi that was harmful to the cultivator. Now, a medicine master like Qin Yaoyin had followed Ding Ning to Jiaodong Commandery. Just these different types of serpent pills were an astounding fortune, and could be made into powerful pills with different effects. Moreover, these Flood Dragon cores were only a part of it. In addition to the Flood Dragon core, there were thousands of monster cores of all shapes and sizes stored in different containers. It was hard to imagine how many beasts the cultivators of Jiaodong Commandery had killed in the sea to obtain such great wealth. Lin Zhuzhou followed Ding Ning into the storehouse. He walked to a corner and picked up a coral. This coral was blood red and shined brighter than most gemstones. It also gave off a faint scent of blood. This was blood coral. It was the most powerful spirit medicine in the cultivation world that could strengthen one's energy. At this time, the blood coral in his hand was less than a foot long. But if it was used in medicine, it could make up for the loss of energy from being imprisoned for more than a decade, and increase his energy. When the Qin dynasty had fought the Han, Zhao, and Wei dynasties in the past, they had only obtained a few of these blood corals. The Qin dynasty's apothecaries had made them into pills and used them on the battlefield. At least, at the time of the Great Change in Chongling, the Qin dynasty's treasury did not have any of these blood corals. But now, there was a pile in front of Lin Zhujiu. There were at least 50 of these blood corals, and the longest was more than 6 feet long. Also, because these blood corals had been brewing at the bottom of the sea for tens of thousands of years, their medicinal power was very stable, like a kind of gelatin, so they did not need special methods to store them. At this time, these 50 to 60 blood corals were piled up in front of Lin Zhujiu like firewood. The blood-red light caused Lin Zhujiu to turn red. Jiaodong Commandery is really too small for Zheng Xiu. Zhang Shiwu looked at the many corners of the storehouse and could not help but say. He had been living in seclusion in Chongling as a gardener because he loved flowers and plants. So he had some understanding of some legendary herbs and flowers. At this time, he saw that in many corners, in some unique containers, there were many herbs and flowers that only appeared in records. From a certain point of view, Jiaodong Commandery was crazy. Hundreds of years of silent accumulation, and only 10 or 20% of the things were used. Before Zheng Xiu became the mistress of Chongling, the feeling that Jiaodong Commandery gave people was that it was strong, but just like that. Indeed, in this process of accumulation, if Jiaodong Commandery was slightly presumptuous and gave people the feeling that it was a piece of fat that people coveted too much, then the Jiaodong Commandery families would have countless chances to be eaten in the hundreds of years. When Jiaodong Commandery silently accumulated such terrifying wealth, and a powerful person like Zheng Xiu appeared, Jiaodong Commandery became the overlord of the Qin dynasty. Jiaodong Commandery never lacked powerful cultivators. But for these resources, there were too few young geniuses with good cultivation talent who were worth Jiaodong Commandery investing resources in. If there was not the Bazankendo ground back then, if there was no Yuanwu, if the Qin dynasty was completely under her control, just the spirit medicines in this storehouse could create many cultivators loyal to her. Zhang Shiwu could imagine that if there was such a day, if the Qi and Yin dynasties were still here, then the Qi and Yin dynasties would be shocked to see that under her rule, the number of powerful cultivators that appeared in the Qin dynasty would surpass any era in the history of the Qin dynasty. If there was such a day, then everyone would think that she truly had the mandate of heaven. When the number of something reached a terrifying level, there was no meaning in counting. What needed to be done next was to use it. Ding Ning and the others did not linger in the second storehouse and quickly came to the third. If Qin Yaoyin is here, he may go crazy. When the third storehouse was opened, Ding Ning could not help but say. Qin Yaoyin was most skilled in medicine, but his medicine was mostly used to change beasts. What they saw in the third storehouse was, without exaggeration, one of the most important lifelines of Jiaodong Commandery. The items in the third storehouse were piled up messily, just like the general stores in the streets of Chongling, but many times larger. But overall, they could be divided into 3 types of items. One was records of the habits of the beasts in the sea, maps of the gathering places of the sea beasts, records on how to tame them, and so on. One was materials used to tame the beasts, food that could not be left out during the feeding process, and medicine to increase or maintain their abilities. One was the eggs of some sea beasts, or young beasts that had been put into a deep sleep. In the seas outside Jiaodong Commandery, there were countless kinds of sea beasts. Some sea beasts were weak and could only be used as food. Some sea beasts could not be tamed or had no value in taming. But there were also countless kinds of sea beasts that could be tamed as mounts, or as guardian beasts, or battle beasts for the front lines. At the beginning, Jiaodong Commandery relied on taming beasts to fight against foreign enemies. Right now, this storehouse had countless methods to tame and raise these sea beasts, as well as related records and materials. This storehouse could be called the earliest foundation of Jiaodong Commandery. Chapter 733. If an ordinary cultivator suddenly had a storehouse like this, it would not be of much use. First, he would need a lot of time to study the records inside. Then his cultivation might not be enough to go to the seas where the sea beasts lived. Also, it would take a lot of time and manpower to raise these sea beasts. Maybe he would only be able to raise a few ordinary steeds if he spent his entire life. But Ding Ning was different. He had enough support from Min Mountain Sword Sect, the Chu Nanquan Commanderies, and the Chu army that had retreated to Jiaodong Commandery. From a certain point of view, he did not just have all of Jiaodong Commandery, he also had the support of most of the Chu dynasty and the support of the distant Yin dynasty. Just this storeroom alone could be converted into a terrifying force. But Lin Zhujiu shook his head. He looked at Ding Ning and said, "I do not dare to trust Jing Xiu so easily." Ding Ning seemed to understand his words and did not immediately respond. Zhang Shiwu and Zhang Sun Qinxue could not help but exchange a look. Then Zhang Shiwu could not help but ask, "What do you mean?" With her personality, she will not put all her eggs in the same basket. Lin Zhujiu looked at him and explained, "Even if it is almost impossible for someone to enter here without her permission, she may still be on guard." Zhang Shiwu understood now and frowned. "You mean she may be deliberately mystifying things here? Some records may be wrong, and she may lead people astray? She is the kind of person who will leave a backup at any time. If she cannot have it, she would rather destroy it so others cannot have it." Lin Zhujiu nodded. "Records and catalogs are not like those medicines. We only need to test the effects to know if the medicine is real or fake. The methods recorded in the records can only be known after using them. So I would rather believe that she may have such a design. If one does not know the trick and follows the records, perhaps they will spend a lot of effort and waste the materials but still achieve nothing." Zhang Sun Qinxue was silent for a moment and said, "I also agree that there is such a possibility. No matter." Ding Ning's voice sounded. Zhang Sun Qinxue looked at him strangely. Ding Ning looked back at her and smiled. "You neglected Shouchen of Thunder Fire Daoist Temple." Zhang Sun Qinxue was stunned for a moment before she reacted. Lin Zhujiu and Zhang Shiwu naturally did not understand, but Ding Ning did not waste time and explained. "Before coming to Jiaodong Commandery, I went to the Thunder Fire Temple of the Qi dynasty. The heir of this generation, Shouchen, followed me to Jiaodong Commandery. His methods are special. Many of the things here should be excellent materials for him to refine talismans. The larger the scale of the sea beast, the more restricted it is." After a pause, Ding Ning looked at Lin Zhujiu and the others and said, "First, these sea beasts are limited by their habits and cannot leave the sea for long periods of time. The fresh water in the rivers cannot satisfy their needs. The longer they leave the sea, the weaker they become and the more irritable and uncontrollable they become. To organize large numbers of sea beasts to migrate and fight, they need countless beast trainers and also an astounding amount of food. This is a conflict that even Jiaodong Commandery cannot resolve. So in the past hundreds of years, Jiaodong Commandery only maintained a certain number of sea beasts for battle. But the stronger the sea beast, the bones, teeth, and other things are the best materials for Thunderfire Daoist Temple to make seals. The older the seal sect, the better they are at using these bones to make seals. Therefore, we don't need to check whether the records in these ancient books are true or not. This is something we will do when we are bored in the future. Now, we only need to check whether the sea beasts gathering places on the sea maps are true. Even if only half of them are true, it will be enough for us to find enough materials to refine talismans in those sea beast gathering places. You are best at dealing with moves as they come," Lin Zhujiu smiled and said. "Almost all beasts, especially the higher level ones, had a fixed burial place. They would reproduce in a fixed place, and when they grew old, they would die in a fixed place. This was like an unchangeable tradition. Therefore, the places where those powerful exotic beasts gathered would definitely have their mausoleums. I hope we will not make a mistake in the future," Ding Ning said, and then left the third storehouse. He walked to the door of the fourth storehouse and pushed open the closed door. There was a creak. This was not just the sound of the wooden door opening, but the sound of Zheng Xiu's Jiaodong Commandery collapsing. With each door opened, Zheng Xiu would lose something she had. When the door to the storehouse was opened, Ding Ning could not help but shake his head. The things in this storehouse were messier than the third storehouse, but for him, It was so simple it was almost violent. Because almost everything in this storehouse could not be used for cultivation or fighting, but they were all valuable. Every dynasty had a common currency to measure wealth. But following the fall of a dynasty, the currency that was originally very valuable would become useless and worthless. However, all the dynasties recognized some special and extremely valuable items. For example, pearls and gems that people would be enchanted at first sight, or spices that smelled so good, or beautiful things made by workshops that had long been lost. These were the things that were stored in this storeroom. Any item in here, in any dynasty, in any caravan, could quickly be turned into wealth. The richest families of the Qin dynasty were almost all in Guangzhou. But Ding Ning was certain that none of the rich families in Guangzhou had as much wealth as this Jiaodong commandery storehouse. Compared to this treasury, even the wealth that he had handed to Xie Chongsheng was only a fraction of the wealth in this treasury. Do you know what I am thinking? So when he left the storehouse, he could not help but ask Zhang Sun Qinshuan next to him. Zhang Sun Qinshuan shook her head. Of course she could not guess such a guess without any hint. I am thinking that after Xie Chongsheng takes this storehouse, he will start to have a headache about how to spend the money, Ding Ning said. Zhang Sun Qinshuan stilled and then laughed. She laughed out loud and very happily. Xie Chongsheng was publicly known as the best spendthrift in Guangzhou, but if he spent the hundreds of years of Jiaodong commandery's wealth in a short time, he would feel helpless. What made her the happiest was that this was Zheng Xiu's wealth. Thinking of how Xie Chongsheng would spend Zheng Xiu's wealth and worry about not being able to spend it all, she wanted to laugh. There was another creak. Ding Ning opened the fifth storehouse. A faint sweet fragrance entered his nose, and as he breathed, he felt a comfortable warmth in his lungs. This was clearly a fragrance that was beneficial to a cultivator's body. But when he saw what was inside, he was furious. The first four storehouses were weapons, medicine, sea beasts, and wealth. Weapons, armor, terracotta soldiers, medicine that could make cultivators strong, medicine that could heal and prolong life, powerful beasts that could be used in battle, and wealth that could buy people's hearts and buy resources. These were all key to fighting for the world. With these things, as long as there was enough land and enough people, it seemed to be enough to fight for the world. Therefore, when he opened the fifth storeroom, he couldn't help but think about what might be in the fifth storeroom from the list of things he needed to conquer the world. But he had not expected to see something like this. All of the gloomy wooden shelves were lined up neatly with pale, yellow, gelatinous blocks. Chapter 734. Time could dilute everything and could truly settle many things. When the nine-death silkworm truly woke up and found Zhang Sun Qinshuan in Chongling, Ding Ning thought he was lucky. Only he had the chance to see his past clearly and correct his mistakes. In the many years in Chongling, he had thought clearly about love and hate, impatience and impotence. He had slowly settled, going from anxious to calm, as though he had become a completely different person. Therefore, he rarely showed any signs of anger. These faint yellow gelatinous pieces were food. Food was an important thing for armies and cultivators to fight for the world. Most cultivators could not break away from the need for food. The primal energies of the universe they took into their bodies could not completely replace all the substances provided by food. The internal organs of the human body formed their own rules from birth, just like the rules of the sun, moon, and stars. They could not be disrupted. If the organs were out of balance, the energies in the cultivator's body would have great problems. From a certain point of view, in the process of cultivation, the stronger the vitality of the organs, the greater the need for food. Cultivators could not eat for many days, but in one meal, they could eat the food of many or even dozens of people. For ordinary soldiers, as well as some cultivators with low cultivation levels, rations and fodder were even more basic. If they were not full, their fighting power would be greatly reduced. Especially in many battles, the lack of food would affect morale and fighting spirit the most. So before the soldiers and horses moved, the food had to move first. The consumption of food by the army was astounding. For example, the Qin dynasty's spring war against the Chu was an example. Even though they had transported food to the border before the winter and used half a year to store it, the Qin dynasty troops in the Chu did not have enough food now. Food that was small in size and could provide enough heat and a feeling of fullness for a long time were the best of the military rations. In the past, when the Yu dynasty had conquered the world, they had the marching black bee pill. This was a pill made from the honey of the unique black bee and many medicinal herbs. One pill could last 2 days. The same was true for the fruit barley powder of the Jin dynasty. It was a powder made from roasted nuts. It was very convenient to carry around in a bag. Plus, it only needed a small amount of water to make a big bowl. It was very easy to fill one's stomach. The cavalry of the great Jin dynasty usually did not carry any weight and came and went like the wind. However, they could fight in the wild for more than a month without losing combat power because of this top-grade military ration. Ding Ning had never seen the secret military rations like the black bee pills of the Yu dynasty, but he had seen the fruit barley powder of the Jin dynasty. While the production of this food had decreased after the fall of the Jin dynasty, there was still some left. Thus, he was certain that the rations from Jin were far inferior compared to the jelly in front of him. This kind of pale yellow jelly was the legendary mermaid jelly. There were many records in the cultivation world that there was a kind of mermaid in the sea. They were half human and half fish. After absorbing the essence of the sun and moon for a long time, they would turn into humans. But in reality, the mermaid jelly had nothing to do with this kind of mermaid. The material used to make it was a kind of giant clam in the deep sea. This kind of clam was called honey clam. This kind of clam was several meters long. The clam meat only needed to be cooked simply, and some sea salt was added to make it freeze. This kind of freeze was not just rich in beneficial substances. Just a few mouthfuls could maintain the food needs of an ordinary person for several days. Also, the fragrant substances within could stimulate the mind and make people energetic. In the winter, it had the effect of resisting the cold and slightly heating. This kind of thing was naturally a top-grade military ration. In the past, when the Qin dynasty had fought the Han, Zhao, and Wei dynasties, the Qin dynasty had not been as rich as it was now. Many battles were fought with the strength of the cultivators and the will of the soldiers. In the many battles against the Zhao and Wei dynasties, there had been armies of more than 100,000 that died due to lack of food. In some battles that lasted for a long time, there were many tragedies of people eating each other. The swordsmen of the Bazin Kendo ground had been the main leaders of those battles back then. Ding Ning knew just how fierce those battles had been back then. Things like mermaid jelly had appeared in the streets before, but were rare. Jiaodong Commandery had never provided it to the Qin dynasty. The specific reason was that the honey clams were rare to begin with, and hard to catch in the deep sea. The message to everyone was that this kind of thing could not appear in large numbers. But how much was stored in this storeroom? At this time, the shells in the storeroom were piled up like mountains. This amount could support hundreds of thousands of soldiers fighting for a long time. Jiaodong Commandery even had such a store of food for when they fought for the world. Even if, at a certain time, the territory they ruled encountered natural disasters and nothing was harvested, this kind of store was enough for them to win a long battle. They could even think of creating some disasters so that both sides would lose food, but they could rely on the food in this storeroom to win. If the merman jelly stored in this storehouse could be supplied to the Qin military, then how many Qin soldiers would have died in the war against the Han, Zhao, and Wei? No matter where they stood, how many Qin soldiers would have died in the Spring War against the Chu? Ding Ning had personally experienced many battles like this. He had experienced such bitterness in life and death. He had even seen many of his friends fall and die in battle due to helplessness. This was the source of his uncontrollable anger. We will charge, we will take care of the dead, we will hide the good things, and in the end, we will take all the fruits. Lin Juju laughed. He was someone who had experienced those things. So while he did not have much anger on his face, his laughter was exceptionally cold. But will there always be such good things in the world? Debts must be paid in the end. Zhang Shiwu took a deep breath. He suddenly wanted to drink and then run, because he thought of a friend who liked to drink with him many years ago. That friend, because of a lack of food, had defended a gorge and his entire army had died there. What else? Ding Ning said, and then silently walked to the last two storerooms. Weapons, medicine, sea beasts, wealth, and even food for war. Even food that did not need special troops to transport. For Jiaodong Commandery to fight for the world, what did they lack? The last storeroom was very close to the fifth storeroom. Ding Ning waved his hand, and an invisible force formed in front of him, directly pushing the door of the last storeroom open. Chapter 735. The door to the last storeroom opened. A puff of dust fell from the crack of the door, and there was the sound of tiny insects crawling quickly. All the previous storerooms, even if piled up messily, would appear grand due to the primal energies of the universe and the natural light of the crystals and treasures. But no one had expected this storeroom. When the door to the storeroom opened, no light came out. There was only a dark presence and the smell of mold after not being open for many years. This feeling was no different from opening an abandoned storeroom that had not been used for many years. Before the sunlight came into the storeroom, Ding Ning and the others saw that there were no wooden shelves in the storeroom, only mounds of earth like tombs. Such a scene naturally caused people to feel a strange atmosphere. Also, when Ding Ning's perception reached into the mounds of earth, he sensed a familiar scent. There was an explosion. A terrifying murderousness appeared at the top of the storeroom without warning. Countless faint starlight gathered together, forming a cold net that swept towards Ding Ning. Every tiny strand of starlight seemed to contain countless surging waves. There was an independent restriction in this storeroom, and it seemed to be even stronger than the one from the Yu dynasty outside. Ding Ning narrowed his eyes slightly. He simply swung his hand. The sword light of the Great Punishment sword flashed in front of him. Then a glowing crack appeared in the space in front of him, like this sword had cut open space. When the starlight fell into the glowing crack, they immediately shattered, turning into dots of starlight that returned to the stars. Ding Ning's gaze flashed violently, and then he took a step back. What is it? Zhang Sun Qinshua looked at him in shock and worry. She knew just how powerful Ding Ning was right now, especially after he used the Great Punishment Sword. Such a step back had unusual meaning. The things here are very important to her. After a moment of silence, Ding Ning looked at her and said, the vital essence in his body did not fluctuate much. Just now, he had taken a step back, not because of the collision of power, but because the starlight contained a strong will. If he had not retracted his power to show weakness, the shattered starlight would have agitated and created an even more violent yuan qi fluctuation. Perhaps it would have completely destroyed the storehouse. Lin Zhuzhou's expression grew grave. He was very familiar with the smell of the starlight. Jiaodong Commandery and even the Bazin Kendo ground. Other than Zheng Xiu, no one could communicate with the cold starry sky and guide the starlight to land. The will in the starlight was naturally Zheng Xiu's will. Just from the presence of this exchange, he was certain that this storeroom was different from the other storerooms. This storeroom was not something Jiaodong Commandery used to fight for the world, but Zheng Xiu's own secret, something she needed or something she had sealed. A cultivator's perception was naturally more accurate than what they saw with their eyes. When their perception penetrated deep into the storeroom, they quickly obtained the answer. These large and small mounds were tombs. In these mounds of earth, there were rotting corpses. In one mound, there was the skeleton of a dog. Then, in another mound, there was the skeleton of a strange beast. Then, there were the skeletons of some children, male and female, their ages increasing in order. The last few skeletons belonged to cultivators, the skeletons of young girls and youths. In addition to these skeletons, there were many miscellaneous items buried in the mounds. There were children's toys, unfinished paintings, and some letters. The last mound was the smallest, and there was a jar of wine in it. These things were buried in this storeroom and seemed very strange. But when everyone's perception swept over them, when the scenes of these things appeared in their minds, even Zhang Sun Qinshua, who did not like to think, the scenes in her mind connected together into the footsteps Zheng Xiu had taken in her life. She seemed to see Zheng Xiu's carefree growth as a child. She rode a wooden horse, had a rattledrum that all children in Chongling would have, and some toys made of grass. But these things quickly changed to blades and swords. She saw Zheng Xiu personally kill the companions she loved, the ones who had accompanied her. From dogs, young beasts, steeds, and then companions who cultivated with her. And in the end, they fought and killed each other. In the last few corpses of young girls and youths, there was a presence similar to hers. This presence did not just come from the method they cultivated, but also from a similar bloodline. In other words, these young girls and youths should be her brothers and sisters, and cultivated the same method as her. Zhang Sun Qinshuan naturally hated Zheng Xiu the most, but these scenes kept appearing in her mind. She seemed to see Zheng Xiu walk out of Jiaodong Commandery bathed in blood. In this moment, her emotions were complicated, and she did not even know what she was feeling. Ding Ning also sensed silently. When his perception left the jar of wine in the last mound, he took a deep breath and slowly looked up. He said, I personally made that jar of wine in Chongling. Wine can make people forget fatigue and warm up the body. It can also make people forget many unhappiness. So many years after entering Chongling, after many battles, especially after hearing that we had lost some friends, we would drink wine. But we did not make much wine because we did not have much time and were not in a good mood. After making wine, we would make agreements with each other about what to do or when to drink with whom. Ding Ning looked at Lin Zhujiu and Zhang Sun Qinshuan. He did not disguise his sadness or pain, and then said, She seems to have buried all of her past, but no matter what the past is, no matter how many reasons there are, or reasons worthy of sympathy, it is not right to treat a friend like this, to treat a friend's sincerity. Hearing you say this, I am reassured. Lin Zhujiu smiled faintly. It does not matter if it is right or wrong. I'm just worried that she purposely set up the things here to prevent you from walking in here one day, and then these things will only make you weak. For people like her, if your sword essence weakens a bit when facing her, she can kill you. Back then, when I entered Chongling and wanted to attack the Imperial Palace, it was not because of right or wrong, but to kill her. Ding Ning shook his head. But I had not expected so many people to come to Chongling. Their sword essences never weakened, but they did not succeed. Otherwise, Yin Xinlan and the others would not have died in battle. Chapter 736. You do not seem to be disappointed that he treats you like this? If you never have high hopes, you will not be disappointed. If you are not disappointed, it means you are still a little disappointed. In Guanzhong, when Zheng Xiu left the Dragon King's palace and boarded a boat anchored in the river, Yi Xinhe appeared behind her like a ghost. When everyone on the boat had left, and only she and Yi Xinhe were left, the two began to talk. Yi Xinhe was dressed brightly today. His pink robes had red lines that looked like blooming peach blossoms. However, the tone and expression of the two were extremely cold. You have changed slightly. Looking at the momentarily silent Zheng Xiu, Yi Xinhe's lips curled into a mocking smile. It seems like from a fledgling cultivator to loving someone, to becoming a mother, to this age, even though you have been personally destroying many things you love, making you always cold and powerful, these things still left traces in your heart. Do not test me. Zheng Xiu's face instantly turned a few degrees colder, as if there were lonely sparks seeping out from under her skin. Her eyes became colder and colder, but also brighter and brighter. It was as if two stars were burning, and the lonely flames were about to burst out crazily from her eyes. After she said these words, her lips moved slightly as though she wanted to say something, but she felt it was not worth it and only said these words. Yi Xinhe sneered softly. I am not testing you, but reminding you. After saying this, he turned around and no longer looked at Zheng Xiu. After a few breaths of time, he finally regained his calm. Slowly and lightly, he said, one sentence after another. Back then, you and I were the two people chosen by the family, but I felt that your heart was colder and harder than mine. So in the end, you stood in the light, and I stood in the dark, willing to be your shadow. So never let me feel that you will become weak. Never let me feel that you are not as strong as me. Otherwise, rather than you destroying everything, it is better for me to destroy everything myself. You should never have such thoughts, Zheng Xiao said coldly. Otherwise, the only one you can destroy is yourself. Yishina didn't get angry. Instead, she smiled faintly. There was a gentle breeze on the surface of the river. The multicolored light fell from the west and shone on Zheng Xiao's body, making her phoenix robe even more beautiful. At the same time, her shadow was pulled back into a long shadow. Yixinha was standing in her shadow. No one in the world could understand why he would betray the Bazinkendo ground, but the truth was so simple and cruel. Because he was originally from Jiaodong Commandery. In reality, for hundreds of years, Jiaodong Commandery had been sending people from Jiaodong Commandery to many sections. Many people even became important people in the sections. Yi Xinhe was just one of the Jiaodong Commandery cultivators who hid their identities and were sent to other places to grow up. The difference was that he was one of the people chosen by Jiaodong Commandery. He was the leader of the shadows in Jiaodong Commandery. Only he knew who in the other shadow sects were from Jiaodong Commandery. As the boat sailed on the river, a cool breeze blew. Zheng Xiao and Yi Xinhe were just standing on the boat. When night fell and darkness completely enveloped the two figures, faint starlight fell from the sky, like countless summer fireflies dancing around the ship Zheng Xiao was on. Zheng Xiao's surroundings gradually lit up, but Yi Xinhe's figure had disappeared behind her. A small boat came towards the waves. One could only vaguely make out a man dressed like a scholar standing on the boat. However, even though he was standing quietly with his hands behind his back, the small boat beneath his feet, facing the waves of the great ship's movements, his figure naturally had a type of iron-blooded aura. When he came close to Zheng Xiao, the faint starlight shone on his face. He was Marquis Li. After Zheng Xiao sent troops to surround Min Mountain Sword Sect, most Qin people, including some marquises, could not understand why he would risk offending many cultivation places to attack Min Mountain Sword Sect. Of the 13 marquises of the Qin dynasty, he should have been the one suppressed by Zheng Xiao. But not long after, everyone knew the answer. Zheng Xiao was building workshops in Guanzhong, and his army was stationed in Guanzhong. Many of the officials and generals with real power in Guanzhong became his subordinates. In Guanzhong, where rich merchants gathered, power meant wealth. In a short amount of time, he had gone from a general with power on the border to the most powerful person in Guanzhong. At this time, the new powerhouse of Chongling was by Qi. Outside Chongling, in the vast lands of the Qin dynasty, Marquis Li was undoubtedly the person with more vested interest than Bai Qi and Huang Jinwei before him. The small boat crashed into the large boat, but the two did not make any sound and just gently leaned against each other. Marquis Li's figure moved, and he stood in front of Zheng Xiao on the large boat. Then he bowed slightly. Heavy Cloud Town, the one who manages the banks for the families in Guanzhong, is called Third Young Master Guan. Zheng Xiao did not return the bow and said coldly. Marquis Li bowed again. This time his bow was more sincere. In the past few weeks, while the families of Guanzhong appeared to be in agreement on the surface, they had many secret businesses that no one knew about. Especially when they sensed that their future days would not be as uncontrolled as before, and might even have the same result as many of Chongling's cultivation places, the families of Guanzhong quickly moved their businesses. For these rich merchants who had businesses all over the dynasties, it was not a problem to do business anywhere. But for large amounts of money to flow, they naturally had to rely on banks. For a long time, there had been multiple masters in Guanzhong who operated these mysterious and reputable banks. If one could control these banks, or if they could grasp some of the businesses and clues, the benefits they could obtain would be much greater than the business on the surface. Marquis Li knew very well how much he had to pay to obtain Zheng Xiao's casual words. Yet even though his bow was sincere, it did not mean that he liked this mistress from Jiaodong Commandery. Why did you not have me go to the Chu? Are you worried about letting a tiger into the mountains? He looked up at Zheng Xiao and asked directly, You feel that someone like Su Qin is easy to control? But how much benefit can he give you in the Chu? Zheng Xiao also looked up. She looked even higher at the stars in the sky. I am not the one who has such worries about the 13 marquises of the Qin dynasty. Some people want to build a stable and perfect country, but for me, any perfect thing built is used to be destroyed in the end. The more beautiful the meteor, the shorter it is, in my opinion. So what if you or someone else becomes the new king of the Chu? The so-called throne is only called a throne if one can sit firmly on it. Marquis Li had experienced many things, but inexplicably, when he heard her words, he felt cold inside. Sit firmly in Guangzhou. When you go to the Chu, I will not stop you. Zheng Xiu's cold and light voice passed into his ears again. But in the future, he will not allow me to act as I please. So you have to sit firmly in Guangzhou first. Chapter 737. Was any perfect thing built to be destroyed in the end? Marquis Li bid farewell and turned around. He thought of these words, and thought of the famous generals and beauties recorded in the past countless years. He felt these words were very reasonable. What happened to the dynasties that once ruled the world? I did not want too much. That was why when he boarded his own small boat, even though he didn't turn around to look at Zheng Xiu again, he instead calmly said, my position of Marquis was obtained through the sacrifice of many brothers' lives. I will not be greedy, but at the very least, I have to live up to those bones buried underground. As long as you understand. Zheng Xiu was slightly tired and did not want to speak, but she still responded calmly. She looked at Marquis Li's lonely back on the boat. She knew that the greatest difference between him and the other marquises was that he was a true lone wolf. Many years ago, she had already seen clearly that many marquises were powerful because they had many powerful retainers by their side. Marquis Li was powerful because those who had followed him to the north and south and survived had naturally grown into powerful figures. The subordinates that lone wolves brought were all terrifying lone wolves. Other than being unafraid of death, these people also had a kind of madness. Just as Marquis Li had said before he left, they needed great fame and status, not necessarily for themselves, but to be worthy of those bones that had helped them climb to their current status. The moon was on the branches. Zhao Gao slowly walked out of Hu Hai's bedroom. There were 2 tall laurel trees in front of this bedroom. These 2 laurel trees had been moved from a mountain outside Chongling. They had grown for an unknown number of years, and the leaves and branches covered the path in front of the hall like a canopy. The Chongling Imperial Palace had experts who took care of flowers and plants. They had even set up formations to guide suitable primal energies of the universe, so that these 2 laurel trees would bloom several times longer than ordinary osmanthus trees. At this time, the ordinary laurel trees had not bloomed yet, but these 2 old trees were already giving off a rich fragrance, and the flowers were golden. The fragrance and enchanting scent caused the night to become soft, warm, and peaceful. Zhao Gao had used Han Yuchen's identity to enter the Chongling Imperial Palace. He had destroyed his own cultivation, but he still could not adjust to the heaviness of his body. The feelings of a cultivator still lingered in his mind, but his body was uncontrollably tired. His footsteps were a little abrupt in this silence, and they were too loud. A gentle energy silently flowed towards him. When it touched his body and caused his sore legs to loosen, he realized that the other divine doctor of the Chongling Imperial Palace, Mu Yunjin, was standing in the shadow of the tree in front of him. A doctor's heart is benevolent, and the appearance is born from the heart. Therefore, famous doctors often look kind. Mu Yunjin was the same. In his early years, he was born in the Qin dynasty. Before the reform of the Qin dynasty, the so-called hard labor usually came from criminals, prisoners of war, and some criminals who were implicated. Laborers were usually sent to places far away from their homes. They had to dig rivers and dig mountains. Out of 10 stops, only 2 or 3 would survive. In his early years, he was a sinner who was implicated by the sins of his family. He practiced medicine while being a laborer and had seen many sorrows. Now, many of the past had become the wrinkles of compassion on his face. He knew that Han Yuchen had also been a prisoner of war of the Han. In the end, he was pardoned to practice medicine in Chongling. He had a similar past to him. So when Zhao Gao entered the palace, he he had taken care of him. Today, when he looked at Zhao Gao, there was a hint of respect in his eyes that was filled with kindness. Previously, Imperial Prince Hu Hai was frightened too much. My methods were not effective. Mr. Han, you only used medicine in the past few days, and Imperial Prince Hu Hai was able to sleep peacefully. I really admire you. After bowing to each other under the laurel tree, he did not exchange pleasantries and asked humbly, I see that Mr. Han's prescription does not seem to have any special spirit medicine. What is the reason? Mind-calming flower. Zhao Gao looked at this doctor and said. Mu Yunjin stilled. Of all the medicine that calmed the mind-calming flower was the most ordinary one. Its effects were not astounding. He did not know why Zhao Gao mentioned this at this time. Zhao Gao looked at him and explained softly. When Xin Xian was torturing him, he used large amounts of medicine made from the mind-calming flower. So his nightmares grew, he was unsettled, and his energy was out of balance. This was not just because of the psychological trauma caused by the torture, but also because of his body's addiction to medicine. This is the crux of the problem. Mu Yunjin's heart immediately turned cold. His face paled slightly, and he immediately reacted. The effects of the mind-calming flower were originally low, but Xin Xian had used an unknown amount. This mind-calming flower had the effect of calming the mind. After using large amounts, and then torturing Zhao Gao to a terrifying limit, he kept on using this medicine to make him collapse. Using an excessive amount of medicine to calm the soul, and having Zhao Gao in that state again and again, this method could only be described as perverse and terrifying. So you used countless medicines in small amounts on Hu Hai in the past few days. You only felt this, and needed to judge what medicine Xin Xian used on him? He controlled the coldness coming out of his body, took a deep breath, and asked Zhao Gao. Zhao Gao nodded. First, use a certain amount of mind-calming flower to make Imperial Hu Hai's addiction to this medicine not become so strong. Then use other medicines to slowly remove this addiction. At the same time, slowly adjust his energies. When his sleep and organs are in harmony, the other symptoms will not be a problem. Mr. Han is as divine as expected, worthy of respect. Mu Yunjin sighed respectfully and then said, but Mr. Han still needs to watch the changes. I fear that Mr.'s body will not be able to handle it. No matter, I will be reassured in 2 days. Zhao Gao and Mu Yunjin spoke a few more words. Looking at the other's back, Zhao Gao knew that starting today, no doctor in the Chongling Imperial Palace would doubt him. Doctors like Han Yuchen and Mu Yunjin each had their own strengths. In reality, Han Yuchen's methods were naturally not much better than Mu Yunjin's. However, in his and Han Yuchen's plan, Xin Xian himself was the starting link. From the start, the mind-calming flower and other medicines had been set up by Han Yuchen. There was no difficulty in setting the questions and solving them himself. In those months, Zhao Gao had studied medicine day and night, but he still worried that his knowledge in this area would be exposed. This could be his only flaw. So in his short conversation with Mu Yunjin, he felt it was more dangerous than ever. But Mu Yunjin no longer had any doubts about his medical skills and was full of respect. After passing this obstacle, he did not need much time. For Zhao Gao, the path ahead was smooth. Even more importantly, Yuan Wu was not in Chongling, and Zheng Xiu was not in Chongling. This was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. He took a deep breath, slowly turned, and walked back to Hu Hai's sleeping palace. As Hu Hai snored heavily, he walked back to Hu Hai's bed. Chapter 738. Hu Hai was in a deep sleep, but his expression was rich, sometimes vicious, sometimes fearful, sometimes his muscles trembling like he was convulsing. Zhao Gao looked calmly at him. This was a pitiful young person. Xin Xian had been in charge of the great floating water prison for many years. Other than cultivation, he studied all kinds of interrogation methods. Some methods could not be used on a criminal at the same time to prevent the criminal's mind from completely collapsing and not being able to give him what he wanted. But these methods were all used on Hu Hai at the same time. Xin Xian did not need Hu Hai to give up any secrets hidden deep in his heart. He just needed Hu Hai to obey and turn this obedience into an instinct But when Zhao Gao heard these methods from Shen Xian, he felt that they were inhumane. But was this young imperial son really worthy of sympathy? Why did such a situation not fall on Fu Su, but on him? Because Hu Hai had been violent since childhood. Even if he was an evil person, he did not like other evil people. In Shen Xian's view, just some of the things Hu Hai had done when he was young. If he was not the son of Zheng Xiu and Yuan Wu, he would have been sentenced to death. So whether a person was worthy of sympathy and what kind of situation they would face in the future was usually related to themselves. When he became a monster that would do anything for revenge, Zhao Gao was certain that he would not have a good result in the future. But the key was whether this result was the result a person wanted. If he could only reunite with his family and loved ones at the moment of death, then the moment of revenge and death was the final destination he wanted. Zhao Gao was no longer a cultivator. He no longer had sharp senses, so he had to be more careful. He stood silently in front of Hu Hai's bed for a long time. After confirming that there was no one nearby, he lowered his body and lowered his voice as much as possible. He whispered the two words Momo in Hu Hai's ear. Like a hidden formation had been activated, Hu Hai's body trembled, his eyes empty and dazed as he woke up. "Mr. Han?" He looked at Zhao Gao and called out softly as if he was talking in his sleep. He did not know why he had suddenly woken up. He just thought that his illness had acted up like before. Your illness is in your heart and not in your appearance. Zhao Gao picked up a bowl of medicinal soup and handed it to Hu Hai. He looked into Hu Hai's eyes and said softly, "Healing the heart is not about using medicine." Hu Hai started to drink the medicine out of habit, especially the smell in the medicinal soup, which ignited an inexplicable thirst deep within his body. He could not understand this feeling. He only felt that he really needed this bowl of medicine. However, he had only taken a sip when he heard Zhao Gao's words. For a moment, he did not know whether to drink it or not. His eyes actually became blurry. In the next moment, he lost control of his emotions. He threw the bowl of medicine away and threw himself in front of Zhao Gao, crying, "Mr. Han, what should I do? You were captured by Shen Xian and suffered humiliation. However, the most important thing isn't how much you've suffered. It's that you've suffered so much that others look down on you." Zhao Gao looked at Hu Hai calmly and said, "If you want to recover, you need others to look at you again. They won't dare to look down on you." Hu Hai stopped crying and looked up blankly. "You don't dare to look down on me?" Zhao Gao nodded and said, "If you want people to look up to you, you have to have power, your own power, a power that makes others fear you. How can I have the power to make others fear me?" Hu Hai looked in puzzlement at Zhao Gao. His eyes were filled with desire and terror. The doctors in the palace are all quacks. After so many days of treatment, they still can't find a cure. Instead, they let you not recover. What a joke. You should change these doctors first. As for these doctors, let them disperse to the various cities. Some of the young and strong ones who don't have much reputation go to the border army. The border army just happens to need a large number of doctors. Zhao Gao didn't give a direct answer. Instead, he said a few words. Hu Hai was stunned for a moment and then started to cry again. "These doctors and officials are not under my command. How can I change these doctors?" Zhao Gao laughed. He looked disdainfully at Hu Hai and said softly, "Do not forget, you are of the Holy One's bloodline. Now that Fu Su is not here, you are the only imperial son in this city. Now that the Holy One and the Empress are not in Chongling, if you want to do something, you do not need to do it yourself. Your status, your words, are power. They are enough to move many things." Hu Hai's face was covered in tears, but when he heard these words, he seemed to be a drowning person who had found a life-saving straw. He asked in a trembling voice, "Mr. Han, what should I do?" "First, talk to Cheng Ruobing of the Bureau of Rights and have him think of a way to change these doctors." Zhao Gao looked at him and said, "You only have to promise that he will ascend to the position of Bureau Chief of the Bureau of Rights. At the same time, give him some important weapons. Say that he will be more alert while your mother is away from Chongling." Bureau Chief of the Bureau of Rights? Hu Hai looked in shock at Zhao Gao. Inexplicably, he did not dare to question and said anxiously, The bureau chief of the Bureau of Rights is official Su. The vice bureau chief is official Sikong Lin. This Su Fu has not managed the Bureau of Rights for a long time. The Netherfloat fleet has taken over the Chu capital. Su Fu naturally will not return to manage the Bureau of Rights. There will be more important matters. Zhao Gao said with slight disdain. After he leaves, the one to take over is naturally Sikong Lin. But Sikong Lin once gave a gift to that white goat cave youth Ding Ning and has some connection. So Chung Ruobing is the most likely candidate to take over as bureau chief of the Bureau of Rights. After a pause, Zhao Gao looked at Hu Hai and said slowly, "But you should understand one thing. No matter who takes over the Bureau of Rights in the end, Chung Ruobing will definitely think that he is the most likely person to take over as bureau chief of the Bureau of Rights. So as long as he thinks so, he will fall into your trap. As to changing doctors, the battlefield lacks doctors right now. This is a matter of going with the flow." Hu Hai immediately became excited. He wiped away his tears, an abnormal red appearing on his dark face. "Mr. Han, then will I go see official Chung Ruobing?" After asking this, he suddenly thought of his initial question and asked, "Mister, after I see official Chung Ruobing and change all the doctors in the palace, how will I possess my own power and make people fear me? Changing doctors and having Chung Ruobing work for you is only the first step." Zhao Gao patted his shoulder and then handed him a bowl of medicinal soup. He indicated for him to drink slowly and then said, "I will teach you the next step, but you cannot speak of this to others. You have to make everyone feel that you did all of this." Hu Haiyan obeyed. He lowered his head and sipped the medicinal soup as if he was drinking a delicacy. Chapter 739. Jiaodong Commandery on the Sea. Shouchen sat quietly at the edge of the cliff on the island, waiting for the red sun to jump out of the sea. This small island was the 4 eastern islands, just a dozen or so days in circumference. There was no fresh water, and it was completely ignored in the sea. Even some fishermen would not stop here, and there was no shelter from the wind and rain. Yet this small island had a number on the Jiaodong Commandery's map. In the past, Jiaodong Commandery would have cultivators stationed on this island, and there would be some supplies for merchant fleets. Simply speaking, 100 miles from this small island, it was an outer sea where almost no fleets would go. This small island had originally been an outpost for Jiaodong Commandery to observe the movements of the island countries overseas. Among the island countries overseas, there were continuous islands. The larger countries on land were Tianlu, Dongyue, and Donglu. But these island countries with large populations had been conquered by the Qin dynasty's fleets many times. Even when the Yu dynasty ruled the world, they had been harvested many times. These island countries did not have much fighting power now, and were almost all subservient. Currently, for the cultivators who had escaped from the various dynasties, all the islands they could find shelter on were gathered around Borneo. Borneo was hundreds of miles away from the 4 eastern islands, and there were many reefs and dangerous waters. Borneo had hundreds of islands. These islands had been extremely wild since ancient times, and the weather was constantly changing. Snakes, insects, and miasma were everywhere. Only the peripheral islands had people living in them. The large islands in the middle were no different from the land, and were not inhabited at all. There were cultivators from various dynasties who offended the nobles and clans and fled to the outer seas. They fled to the large islands deep in the heart of the Borneo continent and hid in the wild jungles. The weather was changeable, and it was enough to disturb the perception of the primal chi of heaven and earth, making it difficult for the dynasty cultivators to track them down. There were also many unpredictable factors. It was hard to predict the fate of the cultivators who fled into the jungles, but the cultivators who pursued them often died without a doubt. There were also cultivators who did not flee for their lives, but took the risk to enter the depths to search for spiritual medicines and other fortuitous encounters beneficial to cultivation. In the history of various dynasties, there were people who truly obtained great benefits from it, surviving in the face of death and achieving extraordinary accomplishments. However, those were truly few and far between. However, due to the islands being far away from the mainland and having all kinds of unimaginable spiritual creatures, there were many powerful cultivators in the small island countries on the periphery of Borneo. Many fishermen and refugees who hid their identities also received the protection of those cultivators, settling down on those islands. By now, quite a few small countries with tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people had formed. This was common knowledge in the world of cultivators. That was why, when the red sun rose, before Shochin truly began his breathing exercises, he sensed Ding Ning appear behind him. Moreover, when he sensed that Ding Ning was looking in the direction of Borneo, he knew that Ding Ning's arrival today was definitely for the island countries of Borneo. He turned around and saluted Ding Ning, who had arrived on the island at some point in the morning light. "You probably already know why I'm here." Ding Ning only glanced at this Taoist from the Thunderfire Temple and saw his gaze when he turned to bow. He could not help but smile and say, Shochin said in a manner that was neither servile nor overbearing, "It should be for the islands of Borneo." Ding Ning put away his smile and did not immediately respond. Instead, he narrowed his eyes and looked at the rising red sun by the sea. He said, "Your cultivation progress is faster than I imagined." Shochin knew that this was true praise. He did not speak and involuntarily lowered his head. This was natural humility. "It was not easy for me to find a method for your Thunderfire Temple, combining thunder and fire, taking fire at sunrise. You should have controlled it perfectly these days. Right now, in your body's energy, there is a surplus of true fire and not enough thunder. The less thunder there is, the more spiritual wood there is, and the more spiritual energy there is, the more suitable it is for you to absorb. Borneo has been a wilderness since ancient times, a place where cultivators do not go. It is most suitable for the lightning of chaos that the cultivation world speaks of." Ding Ning looked at the humble and silent Shochin and said slowly and clearly, "In particular, there are many spiritual trees in Borneo that have not died after being bathed in thunder and fire. Naturally, there is a mysterious principle of transformation. If you feel more of their essence, it will be beneficial to your cultivation progress. But vital energy cultivation is just the foundation. In the past, in Chongling, there were many cultivators with higher vital energy cultivation than me, but they still lost to my sword. This is because sword seals, they're all weapons. Weapons are used, you have to know how to use them." Shochin's brow furrowed slightly. He had guessed Ding Ning's meaning, but did not dare to be sure. So he hesitated and did not speak. "You know how to forge seals, but the key is to know how to use seals." Ding Ning said calmly, "Sword essence and seal essence are the same. When the essence, energy, and spirit become one, you have to have absolute confidence when you attack. Absolute confidence comes from two aspects. One is that you have great confidence. You will not be afraid of the enemy and have a way to win in your mind. The other is that it is built on your usual reputation. When the enemy thinks of your previous strength, they will feel fear, and their presence will be weak. A weak presence will not be enough, and everything will be slow." Shochin no longer doubted. Looking at Ding Ning's calm face, he asked, "Sir, you want me to cultivate through battle like you? I want you to first build a reputation that will cause people to feel fear." Ding Ning took a deep breath and slowly exhaled. He looked into the distance with his hands behind his back. His voice passed into the distant sea. Some of the islands in the east were originally occupied by pirates. When the Qin dynasty's fleet went out to sea, the last flower sword master, Yin Xinlan, followed. She was the one who subdued the places that Jiaodong Commandery did not accept. She also went to the border islands of Borneo and made many friends. Guodongjiang, who later died in the Deer Mountain Conference, was the master of Blue Jade Island in Borneo. Guodongjiang was a friend of the Bazin Kendo ground. Yi Xinhe must have invited him and led him into the Deer Mountain Conference. I will settle this debt with Yi Xinhe in the future. Guodongjiang was originally a leader of the Borneo region. He mediated almost all of the conflicts between the islands. But after his death, one of his disciples took over his Blue Jade Island and even changed the name to Blue Whale Island. He forced the surrounding islands to submit and killed almost all of the people close to Guodongjiang. Going against his teacher, and killing his teacher's friends and family. Regardless of whether he had a deal with Yixinhe or Zhengxiu, in my view, there is no need to even issue a sword token. You and your master have already forged 5 seals. I will go with you to Blue Jade Island. You will use the 5 seals on this trip in exchange for the reputation that you, your master, and your sect deserve. As to the future, Jiaodong Commandery has unimaginable materials for making seals. You will definitely be able to make more seals. Shouchen silently listened to Ding Ning's words. There was an inexplicably moved expression on his simple face. Then he bowed again to Ding Ning and said, I will follow teacher's teachings. Chapter 740. The Qi Imperial Palace. At sunrise, a secret letter was delivered to the Qi Emperor's sleeping palace. The person who received the letter in front of the Qi Emperor's sleeping palace was Imperial Censor Zhong Chao. This black-faced, middle-aged man was not just the leader of the young officials of the Qi dynasty, but also the best cultivator of the Qi dynasty in the last century, one of the realm's 7 grandmasters of the Qi dynasty. This kind of grand master and nobleman had naturally weathered countless storms. Even if mountains collapsed or tsunamis crashed in front of them, their expressions would not change. However, when he opened the secret letter and glanced at it, his expression changed greatly and his hands began to tremble uncontrollably. Senior sect brother, what happened? The man beside him was also black-skinned, but he looked younger. What was most eye-catching was his eyebrows. They were not just as black as ink, but there were threads of black energy flowing back from them. This man was Kai Shi, the other realm 7 grandmaster of the Dark Ruins sect. Previously, he had not been an official of the court. But after the change of the 12 shamans, Zhong Chao had been worried about the Qi Emperor's safety and feared a change would occur in the palace. So he had invited him out of the sect and into the Qi Imperial Palace. So Kai Shi and Zhong Chao did not address each other in terms of rank, but as fellow disciples. Zhong Chao glanced at his shitty and wanted to hand over the secret letter for him to read. However, his hands trembled and he couldn't even hand over the thin parchment. Kai Shi had never seen his senior sect brother so shocked. He was extremely nervous. He reached out to take the letter. After a cursory glance, his body froze, and he couldn't help but exclaim, "What?" Zhong Chao Yao swallowed hard, and the muscles on his face twitched slightly. Then he took a deep breath and lowered his hands. While he quickly calmed down, he turned to look at the sleeping palace behind him. His gaze was filled with pain and worry. The change of the 12 shamans was too painful. Not only were the 12 shamans destroyed, but all the powerful inheritances of the founder of the Yin Qi cultivation method were also destroyed. Even the monastery he left behind was mostly destroyed. While most of the cultivators and officials of the Qi dynasty could understand the Qi Emperor's efforts after that day, and many understood why the Qi Emperor and Zhengxiu had made a deal, they were less dissatisfied with the Qi Emperor than before. But no matter what, the 12 shamans were destroyed. Without cause, there was no effect. Many cultivators silently left the Qi capital and stopped working for the Qi Emperor. Ever since that day, the Qi Emperor had been in a trance. His state of mind and cultivation were both extremely unstable. He was unable to concentrate on handling the affairs of the imperial court. Everything was handled by him, Xianghua, and the others. The 12 shamans had dealt a huge blow to the Qi Emperor. It had almost completely destroyed this emperor who had worked hard for the country. Now, the secret letter had sent news that the ancestral sage hall had been destroyed, and all the ancestors' bodies had been taken away by the successor of the Thousand Tombs Mountain. The ancestral sage hall was not just the ancestral grave of the Qi Emperor. Those who qualified to be buried there were all great people. The Thousand Tombs Mountain had many astounding methods. Even if Yin Ying's disciples' vital energy cultivation was not as good as Yin Ying's, at least those methods had been passed down. Regardless of why he had destroyed the ancestral sage hall due to dissatisfaction, he had taken away the bodies for cultivation and would not bury them in a proper place. The inheritances of the 12 shamans were important, but they only made a dynasty stronger. The ancestral sage hall was a symbol of spiritual sustenance. The destruction of the ancestral sage hall from a certain point of view, was more serious than the destruction of the 12 shamans. From the discovery of the ancestral sage hall's destruction to the news being sent to the imperial palace, it should not have taken much time. But the news took many days to reach here. This abnormality was easy to understand for Zhong Chao. The nobles who had been involved in every step knew that the 12 shamans had dealt a fatal blow to the Qi Emperor. If such news reached the imperial palace, no one knew what the consequences would be. Therefore, such a secret letter had already been discussed and debated by countless nobles on the way. He was one of the officials representing the Qi Emperor in court. When this secret letter reached his hands, it was the last stop. It was up to him to decide whether to tell the Qi Emperor. This was the weight of a dynasty and a country on his hands. How could he be calm? To tell or not to tell? What to do if he did not tell? At this time, there were countless cultivators pursuing Bai Shanshui in the Qi dynasty. If he spread the news, would there be more cultivators pursuing Yan Ying's disciple? At this moment, Zhong Chao's body grew colder. He felt inexplicably helpless. Come in? At this time, a sigh came from the bedroom. Zhong Chao took a deep breath again and tried to calm his expression. He bowed his head slightly, pushed open the doors to the bedroom, and slowly walked in. The Qi Emperor was in a daze these days and had hallucinations, so no palace attendants were allowed to enter the bedroom. Only he was resting in peace. But could this emperor really rest in peace? The sun was rising outside. The windows in the bedroom were not open, but it was still dark. Song Chao inexplicably felt that he was walking on a quiet graveyard. On the dragon couch deep in the bedroom, the Qi Emperor sat in his clothes. The moment he saw the Qi Emperor's face, Zhong Chao's body shook slightly. The Qi Emperor's eyes were sunken, his skin and flesh shriveled. In just 2 or 3 days, he seemed to have aged dozens of years and looked like a skeleton. What happened? The Qi Emperor appeared calm. He stiffly raised his head, looked at Zhong Chao and asked softly. Zhong Chao hesitated and did not respond. You don't have to hide it from me. You and your junior brother's Yuan Qi fluctuations are too intense. You have been with me for so many years, but I have never seen anything that could make you so emotional. The Qi Emperor sighed and said, What will come will come. It cannot be avoided. Zhong Chao finally raised his head. He looked at the other's dim eyes and said, The former Sage Hall was destroyed by the air of the Thousand Tomb Mountain. The Qi Emperor was stunned. Many breaths later, he smiled inexplicably. His smile was indescribably bleak. Man proposes, but God disposes. Karma has its own retribution. I cannot compare to Zheng Xiao in scheming, but I still have to fight for the world with her. If I had known this would happen, I would not have put the Qi Emperor in such a state. Help me write a decree. I will announce to the world that I will abdicate. Zhong Chao could not comment on the Qi Emperor's words. But when he heard the last sentence, his breathing stopped and he opened his mouth to speak. The Qi Emperor waved his hand, indicating that he did not need to speak. You and I both know that this is the best for the Qi dynasty. Chapter 741. I am willing to punish myself and be sent to the ancestral temple to reflect. The Qi Emperor looked at Song Chaotong, who was unable to control himself, and suddenly smiled. The throne will be given to Tian Kongjun. He has a virtuous reputation and the blood of the imperial house. He has vast lands and has many experts. Qi Siren and the others are also on good terms with him. As long as you obey and assist him, there will be no problems. There will be no problems? Zhong Chaodong had been able to control himself, but when he heard these words, his limbs turned cold and he started to tremble. He said in a trembling voice, There is no difference between changing the emperor and changing the dynasty. Who knows how many problems there will be? The Qi Emperor shook his head and grimaced. But this is the best method I can think of. He looked down at his imperial robes and slowly said, Other than this, what other method is there to obtain the forgiveness of Consort Zhao and the Bazin Kendo ground? Zhong Chaodong could not argue. The deal between the Qi dynasty and Zheng Xiao could only be limited to the 12 shamans. They could not become allies in the future. When the 12 shamans were completely destroyed, the Qi dynasty was the enemy of the world. Only an emperor like him, truly abdicating, could obtain the forgiveness of his former allies. Or rather, he could obtain some sympathy and prevent those former allies from becoming enemies. There is someone who must be killed. The Qi emperor looked at the silent Zhong Qiaodong and said slowly but clearly, I hope that this matter and my abdication edict will be arranged by you. Zhong Qiaodong suddenly raised his head. He looked in shock and puzzlement at the Qi emperor. He did not know who the Qi emperor still held a grudge against and had to be eliminated at this time. That young person, Su Qin. The Qi emperor looked into his eyes and said seriously, that person is young, but was entrusted with an important task by Zheng Xiu. I don't know why, but when he survived that day, I had an inexplicable premonition that he would be a great threat in the future. Even if this is my personal worry, I hope that this is the last major matter I arrange on the throne. Zhong Qiaodong took a deep breath. Intuition and premonition were illusory things, but they were often accurate. He did not speak. He adjusted his robes and then knelt down in front of the Qi emperor. Don't pursue the matter of the heir of the Thousand Graves Mountain. The Qi emperor sighed tiredly and closed his eyes. No matter how dissatisfied he is, Master Yan's disciple is only dissatisfied with me and not the entire Qi dynasty. Don't let the cultivators of Daki die in the hands of our own people. As long as the Qi dynasty can continue to exist, the history books will naturally judge its merits and demerits. It was noon, and the sunlight on the sea was a little dazzling. On the sparkling surface of the sea, it was as if millions of copper coins were shining. A snail ship unique to the Zheng family of Jiaodong Commandery moved at astounding speed on the sea. On the ship were Ding Ning and Shouchen. The tongue snake raised by Jiaodong Commandery was the best steed. It was faster than the snail boat and saved more energy. However, the tongue snake was easier to control when Qin Yaoyin was around, but after being away from Qin Yaoyin for a long time, it was hard to control. Also, it was not an inanimate object. It was not Ding Ning's specialty when they reached the destination. The Baz and Kindo ground had been in close contact with the overseas islands before the reform of Chongling and knew the route to Borneo. In the records of any cultivation world, the island of Borneo was a bizarre and barren land. Even cultivators of the seventh realm could die at any time if they escaped there. But when he saw the blue jade island that Ding Ning said Guidong had been in charge of, Shouchen could not help but be shocked. The island of Borneo that appeared in front of Shouchen didn't look like an island at all. Instead, it looked like a continuous horizon that completely filled his vision. Islands of various sizes were intertwined. From a distance, it looked like they were embedded together. Many of the islands were very tall, like the legendary Wild Mountains. There were even clouds of various colors entwined around them, making it hard to see them clearly. Most astounding of all, there were some enormous trees on these islands that jutted out of the clouds like enormous buildings. Even from a great distance, one could see them clearly. One did not know how tall these trees were. Some of the outermost islands and the central islands of Borneo were separated by an unknown distance, but these islands did not appear to be barren, especially the largest Jade Island. It was isolated and not connected to the other islands. Under the sunlight, the surrounding sea was blue and extremely beautiful. On the periphery of the entire island, there were many docks made of giant wood. Many ships of various sizes were docked there. This did not give off the feeling of barbarism at all. It was in great conflict with the primitive scenery that one could see from afar. There were all kinds of strange ships docked at the dock, but none of them were particularly large. Perhaps due to the dense reefs and storms in the Borneo region, some of the ships were carved out of some particularly hard coconut wood, while others were made of some unique sea beast bones or even huge shellfish. These extremely exotic ships obviously belonged to this group of islands in the outer sea. Compared to these ships, the snail ships of Jiaodong Commandery were not unique. But when they casually leaned against a dock, Ding Ning and Shouchen were quickly stopped. "You are from Jiaodong Commandery." The interrogators were several young girls, wearing a very strange style of knee-length blue short skirt. The girls were about 17 or 18 years old. Their skin was dark, and there were many unique tattoos on their bodies. The most conspicuous thing was that the girls had some kind of short sword made of bone hanging at their waists. It was white and gave off a faint energy fluctuation. Shochin looked at these girls. He was naturally taller than these girls, so when he looked over their heads, he happened to see that not far from the shore, there were some buildings that looked like military camps. In other words, on this kind of island, there were not only disciples guarding the gates, but also armies. "We are not from Jiaodong Commandery." Ding Ning looked at the girls and smiled faintly. He said, "We are from the Bazin Kindo ground and the Thunder Fire Temple." The girls stilled and immediately became nervous. What do you want?" one of the girls asked. Her voice was the accent of the Jiaodong Commandery, but she was not familiar with it. At this time, she was trembling. Adding on the words themselves, it seemed laughable. "Take us to see your island master," Ding Ning smiled and said. The girl froze where she was. After a long time, she said, "You are really from the Bazin Kindo ground?" Ding Ning frowned slightly, but did not waste words and just nodded. Suddenly, the girl gritted her teeth and shouted. Several sword lights flew from their waists and stabbed towards Ding Ning's chest. Their special short swords, after being filled with vital energy, gave off a bloody smell like they had been soaked in some kind of poison. When the sword lights stabbed forward, they formed a sword formation with the power to surround. However, the difference between their cultivation and Ding Ning's was too great. After several soft sounds, Ding Ning seemed to have stood in place without moving at all. The short swords in their hands collided with each other. Their arms were numb, and they could not hold their swords and flew out of their hands. Chapter 742. Ding Ning's expression was calm and gentle, but in the eyes of these young girls, it was terrifying. They looked at the short swords that had fallen around them and felt the numbness and swelling in their arms. Two of the young girls even started to cry in terror. "Are you afraid of me or of your island master? If you are afraid of me, you do not have to be afraid because I will not do anything to you. If you are afraid of your island master, you do not have to be afraid because I am stronger than your island master." Ding Ning looked at these young girls and said a few words. These two sentences were very simple, but they were exceptionally useful. Even the two girls who were crying out of fear immediately stopped crying and only sobbed slightly. "Are you really stronger than our island master?" The young girl who had spoken at the beginning looked suspiciously at Ding Ning and asked. Ding Ning nodded, smiled, and said, "All of Jiaodong Commandery is under my control. Do you think I am stronger than your island master?" In reality, the Chu dynasty army, led by Consort Zhao, had not entered Jiaodong Commandery yet. He and Lin Zhujiu had only grasped most of the Zheng family's lifeline and had not truly taken over and controlled it. But this was just a matter of time. He could see that these young girls were very simple and did not have much experience. For these young girls, Jiaodong Commandery was the outside world in their subconscious. This simple and violent statement was more effective than any persuasion. As expected, when these girls heard these words, they looked at Ding Ning in a completely different light. "The island master is in the city. I will take you there." The young girl who had spoken at the beginning gritted her teeth and said immediately, "There was a city in this place?" This was the first thought that appeared in Shochin's mind, but then he understood. Since the edge of the island was filled with docks and was so prosperous, it was reasonable that there was a city on the island. The wild and barren feeling in his subconscious should have been removed. Following these young girls, they walked on wooden planks. The island was uneven, but the planks were smooth. There were many people along the way, dressed in different clothing. In Shochin's eyes, some of the clothing was strange, but in the eyes of these people, Ding Ning in his cloth robes and Shochin in his Taoist robes were strange. They looked at them strangely along the way. After walking a few miles into the island, Shochin saw the city the young girl spoke of. This was indeed a complete city. The walls made of white reefs were even taller than the walls of most cities of the various dynasties. However, the city did not occupy a large area. It looked like it could only house tens of thousands of people. However, what was different from the cities of the other dynasties was that the buildings in the city were also very strange. Moreover, they were very densely packed together. On the east side, there was a palace hall that was especially huge compared to these buildings. It directly acted as the city wall on that side. The palace was painted with some unknown paint. Under the sunlight, it was dark blue. Although in Shochen's eyes, it still looked a little strange, but it was as majestic as a mountain. He didn't need to think to guess that it was Guodongjiang's residence. Entering the city, there were many men and women in clothing similar to the young girls leading the way. They had energy vibrations on their bodies, and under the sun, they seemed to have a layer of fish scales. From the battle with Ding Ning at the harbor until now, these young girls leading the way had not sent a message. But the cultivators in the city looked at Ding Ning and Shochen with fearful expressions, as though they knew the identities of the two. Ding Ning ignored them and strolled leisurely behind these girls. Soon he arrived in front of the blue palace in the city. Unlike the people in the city who cowered and avoided him and Shochen, there were two cultivators standing respectfully on the steps in front of the blue palace, waiting for his arrival. The person on the left was a white-haired man. He was tall, had a straight face, and gave people a feeling of great calmness and solemnity. But he did not belong here, because he wore the yellow robes of the Jiaodong Commandery's Zheng family. The person on the right wore deep blue robes and was very grand, inlaid with many gems. He also wore a golden crown inlaid with gems, like an emperor. When Ding Ning walked to the path facing them and was 100 feet from them, the two bowed at the same time. The slightly younger man, who looked like an emperor, took off the golden crown he was wearing and said, "I'm willing to surrender." Shochen was shocked. The young girls who didn't dare to continue leading the way in front of the palace, as well as the cultivators who were hiding in the surrounding streets and alleys, were stunned when they heard these words. Ding Ning frowned slightly. He did not respond and looked at the white-haired man on the left in the yellow robes of Jiaodong Commandery. Then he asked, "Zheng Sha?" The white-haired man was surprised, but immediately answered solemnly, "Yes. You are Guodongjiang's disciple, Wu Donglian?" Ding Ning turned to look at the man dressed like an emperor and asked. The man held the golden crown in his hand. He still did not stand up and said respectfully, "Yes. He wants to surrender directly." "You?" Ding Ning turned to look at Zheng Sha and laughed. "What do you mean?" Zheng Sha said respectfully, "Since Mr. Wang has been reborn, there is no chance to fight. I want to talk with Mr. If Mr. does not mind, I want to use some things to exchange for the lives of some people in Jiaodong Commandery." Ding Ning shook his head simply. "I do not mind." Zheng Sha was stunned. "Does Mr. not want to hear what I have in Jiaodong Commandery?" He was stunned for a moment and looked in disbelief at Ding Ning. "I don't want to." Ding Ning shook his head again, then looked at him and smiled again. Zheng Sha frowned. His expression did not change, but some viciousness appeared on his brow. "Why?" he asked seriously, looking at Ding Ning. "Zheng Xiu once understood me very well, but there was a time when I understood her very well and learned many things about Jiaodong Commandery from her." Ding Ning said coolly, "I know that there are several people in Jiaodong Commandery that she is not willing to make a deal with. One of them is you. Later, I learned that you were one of the teachers responsible for teaching her in Jiaodong Commandery." Zheng Sha calmly listened to these words, and then slowly put his hands behind his back. He looked up at the sky and said, "I had not thought that you would know this from her. It seems that she has some feelings for you. You played a good move." Ding Ning did not respond to him, and said with slight disdain, "Both of you are people I want to kill. One made a deal with me, the other surrendered. This game of chess is difficult to play. If we still kill you, what will our enemies think in the future?" Ding Ning's gaze landed on Zheng Sha and Wu Donglian's faces. Looking at their trembling eyelashes, he said, "Just like on the battlefield, there is a general who will not accept surrender and will slaughter cities at the slightest provocation. No one will want to surrender and fight to the death if they encounter him. But if we do not kill you for benefits, what will the people of the world think?" Zheng Sha's eyebrows rose slightly. He did not disguise or explain because he knew that in front of someone like Ding Ning, Any explanation was unnecessary. But you are wrong. Ding Ning laughed and said, because when one is strong to a certain level, one does not have to think about the possibilities of future enemies. Even more importantly, I do things directly. If I feel that there is a possibility of reconciliation, I will go directly to the sword order to speak. I will not make the enemy's thoughts waver. Chapter 743. If you want to use your life in exchange for all the enemies of the Bazinkindo ground thinking that even if you surrender directly, you will not receive our forgiveness, then you will not succeed. Ding Ning looked at Zheng Sha and said, because before the enemy thinks about this matter, I will tell them if they have a chance of receiving our forgiveness. Zheng Sha's expression gradually darkened. He did not speak anymore. Beside him, Wu Donglian, who was bending over while holding the golden crown, slowly straightened her body and put the golden crown back on her head. When he put the golden crown back on, the subservience on his face completely disappeared. He smiled. His skin was also a little dark, and his teeth were especially white. His gums were also exceptionally red, giving people an inexplicable feeling of blood. But there must be a reason to kill. Even if you do not even give me a chance to surrender, you should know that you are an elder of the same generation as my master, and I am a junior. You killing me is against the rules. He smiled like this and looked at Ding Ning. He said with slight disdain, you can be unreasonable, but you cannot ignore the rules. The accepted rules of the cultivation world, especially many of the established rules of battle, are habits formed when you were at the Bazinkindo ground. He had used the word you at the beginning of his words, but in the last sentence, he purposely said you so that the disdain in his words was even stronger. Hearing his disdain, Ding Ning was not angry. He just shook his head and said calmly, it is best if you follow the rules. Today is not the day I become famous, but the day Thunder Fire Temple proves its name. Wu Donglian and Zheng Sha stilled. Their gazes were filled with surprise as they looked at Shochin behind Ding Ning. Ding Ning continued, his master and your master are of the same generation. When your master became famous, his master was not. So in terms of seniority, they follow the rules. Wu Donglian frowned deeply. He could see that Shochin was only realm 6. In the past, Wang Jingming could surpass cultivation levels and win, but that did not mean other cultivators could surpass cultivation levels and win. Did you become more careful after dying once? He took a deep breath and looked at Ding Ning. Are you afraid that I have some special means? So you send a cultivator to test me first? You have to think clearly. His tone grew heavier as he said to Ding Ning, if I kill him, perhaps all the cultivators in the world will think so. Ding Ning looked at him and saw through his thoughts. He said with slight disdain, don't worry, if Shochin isn't your opponent, I won't attack you. Wu Donglian didn't understand where Ding Ning's confidence came from, but he had already gotten the result he wanted. I'll try to kill him. That would be a good move, because everyone in the world will know that there is someone who can kill the people around you right in front of you. After saying this, he waved his sleeves. A terrifying gust of wind came out of his sleeves, causing his body to float and float behind Shochin. Before he landed, everything behind Shochin, including the people who were standing, was blown away by the wind, revealing a large expanse of empty space. Blue ice crystals that were about an inch long suddenly appeared on the ground that was blown by the gale, as if they were blooming flowers. Wu Donglian was Guodongjiang's direct disciple. Because Guodongjiang admired his talent, he even gave him the Dong in his name. After Guodongjiang's death, Wu Donglian went against Guodongjiang's wishes and took control of several islands here. If Yishao had not failed to kill Ding Ning, and Jiaodong Commandery was about to fall under the control of the Bazinkindo ground, he would have been the king here. He used the country to rule these islands, and at this time, he had the presence of an emperor. The blue ice crystals that covered the ground were clearly the prelude to his next move. If this was a normal duel, he would have already made the first move, but he himself didn't care, only indifferently saying the word please to Shochin. If one felt it was unfair, they would be angry and upset, and their minds would be disturbed. But Shochin was very calm. When cultivators fought against each other, They paid attention to the geography. Fighting the other on Blue Jade Island, he knew that the entire island and this region were the other's weapons. But Ding Ning had absolute confidence in his 5 Shin seals. So he was confident. So he bowed slightly and calmly responded, "Please." The moment the word left his mouth, he crushed a yellow talisman in his hand. In this moment, a wild presence came down from the sky above Wu Donglian's head. Within this violent and enormous aura, there was an indescribable sense of madness, which was completely of the same origin as Guodongjiang. Wu Donglian's feet naturally left the ground, and he floated up. The primal energies of the universe in his body and the vast primal energies of the universe quickly gathered in the surroundings. In a flash, they formed countless bolts of white lightning. The white lightning did not fall directly towards Shochen's body, but were attracted by the blue ice crystals on the ground. Countless strange sounds of thunder rang out from these blue crystals. The power of the countless strands of white lightning was instantly magnified several times. After several turns inside the crystal, they fell towards Shochen from all directions. At this time, only half of the people on the island were residents. The other half were fishermen who passed by, or cultivators who came from the nearby seas to trade. When Ding Ning and Shochen came to the island, Wu Donglian had intended for these people to be witnesses. So many cultivators knew Ding Ning's identity in secret. At this time, countless eyes were watching this duel. When they saw the thousands of lightning filling the world and surging towards Shochen from all directions, all of their expressions changed. This was not just the full power attack of a Realm 7 cultivator. This was clearly the power of a formation. Such a fine attack had nothing to do with sword essence. There was no way to counter it. No matter how exquisite the sword move was, it could not be resolved through technique. Many people were certain that even some of the best of Realm 7s might not be able to withstand such an attack. How could a cultivator at most Realm 6 survive an attack like this? However, it was also at this moment that countless muffled sounds of collisions rang out. Cries of disbelief rang out. Shochen did not die. He didn't even move. Hundreds of yellow shields appeared around him. These shields were as tall as a person and floated around him. There were 7 layers in total. These 7 layers of thick yellow shields rotated and moved. Each layer was different, blocking all possibilities of the fine lightning bolts shooting through. Each bolt of lightning that landed on the yellow shields was like a drum. With a muffled boom, a wave of yellow dust rose. Chapter 744. These shields formed a perfect domain. Outside the domain, the lightning exploded like fireworks, but inside the 3 layers, it was a quiet world. Zheng Sha looked at this scene with disbelief in the depths of his eyes. He could see that this was the seal path. Only this kind of simple and primitive seal path method could allow a cultivator like Shochen, who was far from Realm 7, to keep up with Wu Donglian's speed. Shochen only needed to activate the seal in his hand. He did not need to lock onto Wu Donglian's presence and use his vital energy to gather primal energies of the universe to form true killing intent. Yet he had never heard of such a primitive seal path method being able to activate such power. Just as he was shocked, Ding Ning looked back at him. His body suddenly tensed, and he was filled with coldness. "You are not like Wu Donglian. If you want to disappear, no one in the world can find you. But you are waiting for me here. What do you really want to do?" Ding Ning looked at the coldness in his eyes and asked coolly. Zheng Sha took a deep breath and expelled the coldness in his body. Then he calmed down completely. "I want to see if I can stab you." Ding Ning made a sound of acknowledgement. "Why?" Zheng Sha narrowed his eyes slightly and said, "You have always been the symbol of invincibility, especially after you were reborn. I fear not many people dare to fight you. But even if I cannot kill you, if I just stab you once, many of your enemies will feel different. You will still be injured, and you can be killed." "For Zheng Xiao?" Ding Ning still asked unconcernedly. Zheng Sha shook his head and said seriously, "For Jiaodong Commandery. You should be able to understand. In the past centuries, everything that people like me have done is for Jiaodong Commandery. After a pause, he looked up in the direction of the distant Jiaodong Commandery. He sighed and said softly, "Finally, Jiaodong Commandery is about to reach the peak that everyone hopes for, but it's suddenly collapsed. If there are two people who destroyed Jiaodong Commandery, one is Zheng Xiao, and the other is you." Ding Ning could understand the obsession that Zheng Xia spoke of. This was the belief of many Jiaodong Commandery cultivators. He nodded and then shook his head. "No rush. Wait until I finish." Zheng Xia also understood the meaning of Ding Ning's words. Ding Ning had sensed his killing intent long ago. He and Ding Ning had fought, but the moment Shouchen used the seal, he was so shocked he was dazed. This was the best time for Ding Ning to kill him, but Ding Ning did not attack. This was equivalent to Ding Ning giving him a handicap. Also, Ding Ning's words meant that it was impossible for him to sneak attack Ding Ning. So he nodded slightly in agreement. Shouchen did not move. He stood silently in the circle of the shields. Wu Donglian also didn't move. The depths of his eyes were also full of coldness. He also couldn't understand how this talisman could have such power, but he was sure that before this talisman disappeared, no matter what method he used, he couldn't break it. But any defensive seal essence would dissipate in the end. When the power was exhausted, it would be the time for him to kill Shouchen. However, at this moment, a scene in his perception caused his pupils to contract violently. Shouchen took out 4 talismans from the yellow shields. Shouchen looked quietly at the 4 seals in his hand. His eyes moved and emotional. Of the 4 seals, one was pure white like snow, one was golden red like golden fire, one was green like a willow leaf, one was crimson like the skin of an apple that had just ripened in autumn. If the glory and reputation of Jiaodong Commandery was the belief of Zheng Xia and the others, then the 5 seals, including the Xian shield that had just been used, were his and his teacher's belief. When these seals were used according to Ding Ning's method, they had astounding power, but his teacher could not see it with his own eyes. The Black Shield talisman was made from the Yao core of the earth beasts. The earth beasts were a type of desert tortoise. In the records of cultivators, they were also called earth dragons. They had a gentle temperament, but their vitality defense was extremely astonishing. In the records of cultivators, there had been a fire crane and the earth beast that had fought for a year. The fire crane used all kinds of flames to attack the earth beast, but the earth beast only curled up and defended, and in the end, the fire crane was exhausted to death. Now he had 4 seals to choose from. Low-level cultivators would not have time to think when facing high-level cultivators, but he had enough time to think about which one to use. He thought, and in the end, chose the pure white seal. With some reluctance, he shot out lightning and fire from his hand and shattered the seal. This seal was made by his teacher at the beginning and was called First Snow. The moment he shattered the talisman, countless booms resounded in the sky as if many huge, snowy mountains were collapsing. His body was immediately shrouded in wind and snow. Countless white snowflakes shot out from between his fingers. Every snowflake that flew out split into countless pieces, and between each piece of snowflake, a substantial gust of wind appeared. The yellow shields surrounding his body were pushed away by the terrifying wind and snow. Looking at the yellow shields being pushed away piece by piece, looking at the gaps between the shields, Wu Donglian felt that an opportunity had arrived. However, at this moment, his expression completely changed. He lost track of the other in his perception. That ball of snow expanded at an astonishing speed, and the yuan qi that exploded was so astonishing that it blocked his perception. A loud explosion sounded from beneath his feet. His body shot backwards at an astonishing speed. In an instant, he was like a meteor, and even passed through the huge blue palace behind him. It was also at this moment that all of the wind and snow stopped expanding outwards and instead moved forward. The white snowflakes turned into countless white lines that shot forward and landed in front of him. Wu Donglian's face was extremely pale. He had used all his power to retreat, but he still could not deal with this terrifying seal essence. In the time it took for these tens of thousands of white lines to hit his chest, his hands moved upwards. Cries of surprise rang out in the city. The blue palace under him instantly lost color and turned yellow like a withered leaf. The lost blue turned into real ocean water. A dark blue wall of water appeared in front of him, covering the sky and the earth, colliding with the countless pale, white lines. The white lines stabbed into the deep blue water wall, and his body was still flying backwards. Dots of white passed through the deep blue water wall, but could not completely pass through, and gradually froze. The enormous water wall, as wide as the palace, froze in the air at the top of the palace. Under the sunlight, the yellow palace had a deep blue ice wall. White cold energy flowed along the ice wall to the top of the palace, and then flowed down like a white waterfall. Chapter 745. When the deep blue water wall froze, Shochin had already chosen the third talisman. This seal was green, and it was not an ancient rectangular seal. The two ends were thin and long, like a willow leaf that had grown several times larger. As cries of alarm rang out, the gazes of the cultivators in the city were no longer just filled with confusion, but also fear. The most terrified was Wu Donglian. He had cultivated here with Guodongjiang since childhood and knew all the formations in the city like the back of his hand. This was his city, his territory. Just now, he had even used the palace protection formation to block Shochin's attack. Even more importantly, he did not know how to defeat Shochin's seal path. The seal essence did not surpass Realm 7, but it gathered too quickly or exploded too quickly. Even more importantly, this seal essence was like many cultivators attacking together, and the primal energies of the universe gathered at the same time was enormous. That was why right now, he even had a misconception that he wasn't fighting against a single cultivator, but against several especially massive sea beasts. Only enormous beasts that could absorb astounding amounts of primal energies of the universe into their bodies, and their Yao cores could release such vast power in an instant. He knew that if he wanted to defeat Shochin, he had to attack before Shochin cast the seal, and kill him in one blow while Shochin cast the seal. But there was always a great gap between hope and reality. When a sharp howl sounded in front of him, Shochin had already crushed the third seal in his hand. A patch of green light filled the world in front of him, or rather, the entire city. All the cultivators seemed to be covered by a green leaf and lost all traces of the world in front of them. At the same time, their perceptions seemed to disappear. They knew they were still in the city, but they could not see anything and could not even sense the existence of other people a few feet away. This green light seemed to consume everything. A long spear appeared in front of Wu Donglian. This long spear rippled with powerful life bond presence. It looked like an enormous fish bone, dozens of feet long. It was wrapped in an inky green light. The moment it appeared, it pierced through the thick ice wall in front of him. But when the green light shone, the long spear immediately shrank back in front of Wu Donglian. Wu Donglian gripped the long spear with both hands. He was very nervous, and the vital energy flowing out of his skin continued to expand. He had completely lost track of Shochin in his perception. This was not the most terrifying thing. Most terrifying was that he had lost his connection to many of the formation hubs in the city. He could not sense the location, and his vital energy could not reach. He could not use the power of the formations for his own use. He could only rely on his own power. Ding Ning smiled faintly. Even his perception was limited to an area of several zhang around him. He guessed that the material used to make this seal was related to the blue bird. The name of the blue bird was very ordinary, but in the records of cultivators, this was a kind of fast and intelligent Yao beast. They always appeared in pairs. The female bird would release the energy in the Yao core to block the enemy's perception. The male bird would turn into lightning and take the chance to attack the enemy. At this time, the only person present whose perception was not obstructed was Shochin himself. In his field of vision, these green lights did not exist. They only existed in his perception as countless gentle lines, like countless willow branches dancing in the breeze. Only he knew that he was still standing at his original spot and had not moved a step. At this time, he still had time to think. He looked at the two remaining seals in his hand and thought for a moment. Then he put away the crimson seal. At the same time, he raised his head and turned his vital energy into thunder and fire that flooded into the golden red square seal in his hand. At that moment, even though everyone's perception couldn't reach him, they still felt a terrifying aura explode from him. There was a rumbling sound. The enormous ice wall in front of Wu Donglian exploded. His vital energy had just passed through the ice wall and was suddenly hit by a powerful force. He immediately felt like his body was being torn apart. The shattered true essence scattered in all directions, but it still had a unique connection with his body. It was also at this moment that he clearly sensed what was attacking him. An extremely shocked cry burst out from his cold, thin lips. Breaking through the ice wall, what charged at him was an enormous golden stream of fire. This golden stream of fire was hundreds of feet long and was in the shape of a dragon. The flames were so condensed they were tangible and formed golden scales in the air. The flame came at his face. His hair immediately dried and started to burn. With a crackling sound, he didn't have time to think. The long spear in his hand pierced towards the head of the fire dragon in front of him. The life vitality in his body violently surged out from the tip of the spear, and the strength of the spear drew a crystal mark in the void. This spear contained a taste that could shatter the void and destroy everything. However, what he did not expect was that when the spear stabbed out, the oncoming fire dragon opened its mouth and swallowed him in one gulp. Within the flames, there was still fire. Not only his hair and beard, but even his clothes were instantly scorched and burned. Amidst the flames around him, he saw countless red sword lights. This was a true metal presence. Inside the fire dragon, there were hundreds of thousands of swords madly accelerating and charging towards his body. Wu Donglian screamed. The spear in his hand shook into countless shadows. In this moment, he did not know how many times he stabbed. No one knew what happened at that moment. They only heard the sound of metal striking metal exploding in the air like a torrential rain. In the next instant, the entire city began to shake. Waves of terrifying origin chi energy burst forth from every corner of the city, as if many giants had suddenly burst out from the ground of the city. The indigo light that had filled the city and obscured everyone's perception disappeared. Everyone saw that there were several huge balls of light that stood in the corners of the city. Some of the buildings that originally existed had already disappeared, while others were crazily spewing out yuan qi as if they were burning intensely. But the most eye-catching scene was still at the top of the palace. The shadow of an enormous golden fire dragon was disappearing. Inside the golden fire dragon, Wu Donglian's figure appeared. His body had turned charcoal black. The life-bond spear in his hands was still swinging, but his charcoal black body had been pierced by countless red swords. There was a loud boom. Everyone's heart violently contracted. Just as everyone saw his figure clearly, those red long swords turned into flowing molten iron. Wu Donglian's body disintegrated, crushed by the countless streams of molten iron that gushed out from his body. Other than Ding Ning, everyone looked in disbelief at this scene. It was at this moment that they realized that the eruption of power in the city was the result of many formations being activated at the same time. When Wu Donglian was on the verge of death, he frantically scattered the power in his body and activated all the formations in the surroundings that could be activated. This was like the last dance of a cultivator who had been stabbed in the vitals on the battlefield. In the Borneo region, Wu Donglian, who was second only to Guadongjiang, had been killed like this, and the other had only used for seals? What kind of method was this? Zheng Sha took a deep breath. He narrowed his eyes and felt this did not conform to the logic of the cultivation world. At this time, Ding Ning's light laughter sounded. I said that today is the day the Thunder Fire Temple is recognized. Chapter 746. A cultivator far from Realm 7 killed Wu Donglian with just 4 talismans, and Wu Donglian was in his own city. This is the day that the Thunder Fire Temple is righted. Starting today, everyone will feel that he is a monster. Zheng Sha moved his gaze away from Shouchen and finally landed on Ding Ning. But today, he will not be the only one to be righted. It may be me, or it may be you. Ding Ning smiled. He understood Zheng Sha's meaning. Zheng Sha was the teacher of many cultivators in Jiaodong Commandery. He taught the direct descendants of the Zheng family to cultivate and pick the best among them. Most importantly, he used the law of the strong surviving and the weak dying to change the lives of many Jiaodong Commandery cultivators, including Zheng Xiao. Many of the cultivators you taught are famous in the world, but as the teacher, you are unknown. If you can stab me today, you will be famous in the world. Ding Ning slowly put away his smile and looked at this Jiaodong Commandery expert. He said, "But do you know what I am thinking now?" Zheng Sha frowned and said in a cold voice, "You may be thinking, if not for me, maybe Zheng Xiao would be different. Maybe you and Zheng Xiao would have different results." You are wrong. I thought about this possibility a lot in the first few years, but as my mind changed, I no longer care about such meaningless emotions. Ding Ning shook his head and said calmly, "Back then, Wang Jingming proved in Chongling that he was stronger than all the swordsmen in Chongling. Before the last battle, the world only cared about who was stronger between him and the Grandmaster of Zhao Jinhut. But the Grandmaster of Zhao Jinhut died in King Zhao's scheme. Who was stronger between him and the Grandmaster of Zhao Jinhut is an eternal mystery. But now it is different. Even if the world thinks that I am Wang Jingming reborn, I am not Wang Jingming back then. Even if I could escape from Yi Zhao's formation, I did not rely on my own power. So who knows how far I am from Wang Jingming back then?" After a pause, Ding Ning looked at Zheng Sha and said, "If you could stab Wang Jingming back then, all the cultivators in the world would think you were one of the strongest grandmasters. But even if you could stab me now, would the cultivators in the world really think so?" Hearing these words, Zheng Sha suddenly laughed, revealing his snow-white teeth. Any battle of sufficient importance will spread far and fast in the world of cultivators. That is why in today's battle, you have to display a bit of strength. "I'm not done yet." Ding Ning shook his head and raised his head. "Those are the thoughts that others may have. My thought is, if it's a one-on-one duel, who can stab me with a sword? Also, the people who can truly represent Jiaodong Commandery have been killed by Zheng Xiao and Chongling. After killing you today, none of the old people of Jiaodong Commandery will be left." Ding Ning was not as tall as Zheng Sha. His tone was just as calm as usual. However, when he raised his head and said those words, the feeling he gave everyone was as if his body was as tall as the clouds, and he was looking down at everyone from high above. This was a presence that could not be described with words, especially when Ding Ning said, "If it's a one-on-one duel, who can stab me with a sword?" At that moment, many of the cultivators present, especially the cultivators with relatively higher cultivations, felt great fear. Zheng Sha's expression changed slightly. He could not help but open his mouth, wanting to say something. But Ding Ning did not give him a chance to speak. His gaze pierced Zheng Sha's eyes like lightning. "Since you want to try, what are you waiting for? For me to attack first?" The words were not polite, domineering, and rude. But this was not a pure duel, and was completely different from the sparring between Chongling swordsmen. For Zheng Sha, this was the best. He did not have the confidence to let Ding Ning attack first. Of course, he would not refuse Ding Ning's invitation. His fingers moved slightly. This movement was very gentle, and did not even cause a sound in the wind. But an invisible thread in the world was moved by him, and a kind of original balance was broken by him. There was a muffled sound in the sky. Everyone could not help but look up at the sky. Everyone saw a streak of sparks falling from the sky at a high speed. The star energy condensed into star fire, and looked down at the world like a god. This was Zheng Xiao's unique method. In the knowledge of all cultivators, only Zheng Xiao had comprehended this method, and this method was a combination of the secret arts of Jiaodong Commandery and the Bazin Kendo ground. That was why when they saw this spark, most of the cultivators in the city felt great shock. However, in the next moment, they all saw some clues. There was a meteor inside the fire, or to use the words of the cultivator records to describe it, it was a piece of meteor or sky metal. This was the remnant of a meteor, the nodules formed by the burning of all kinds of essence metals in the star. In the world of cultivators, many weapons were made from this kind of sky metal, such as the Sword Mountain sword. But Zheng Sha's life bond item had not been changed by any means. It still maintained the original appearance of this piece of sky metal, and even the traces of melting and burning had not changed. Because it had not been changed, the star energy in this house-sized piece of sky metal was left behind. The star energy was wild in the perception of cultivators, like rampaging beasts that tore apart everything they encountered along the way. The star energy and Zheng Sha's life bond energy in this piece of sky metal, and the primal energies of the universe that came in contact with it when it fell, created terrifying flames and smoke. So Zheng Xiao's star fire was pure, silent, and cold. But the star fire that Zheng Xia used was wild, burning, chaotic, and crazy. The more chaotic the energy was, the more it could not be understood, and the more it could not be stopped. Zheng Sha's life bond item was like a beast that he had nurtured with his flesh and blood. Once it was released, even he could not stop it. Most importantly, the true target of this star of fire with a strong flame tail in the air was not Ding Ning, but firmly locked onto Shouchen's position. Those cultivators who had heard his conversation with Ding Ning understood his true intentions now. He wanted to kill Shouchen, even if he was instantly killed by Ding Ning. His true intentions were not to wound Ding Ning, but to kill the people around Ding Ning with his own power while Ding Ning was present. He wanted to use his actions to tell everyone in the world that no matter how invincible Ding Ning was, he could not protect the people around him. If an invincible person could not stop his opponent from killing in front of him, then it was very sad. Chapter 747. Zheng Xia did not care if he was killed by Ding Ning. He only cared if he could achieve his goal. The life source energy that had been accumulated in his body gushed out at this moment. To be able to nurture such a piece of heavenly metal as his life source item. All these years, the 5 qi in his body had been constantly eroded and destroyed by the star energy in this piece of heavenly metal. Therefore, his life source energy was also mixed with the star energy. Therefore, when it gushed out at this moment, the heaven and earth around him also began to burn. His body was also surrounded by blazing and berserk sparks. Today, I am also a falling star. Who can save him while not being wounded? The corners of Zheng Sha's mouth were so dry that they started to crack. This caused the smile on his face to be exceptionally cruel, and it continued to widen. When he spoke like this, he used the simplest and most violent method, madly accelerating and then charging towards Ding Ning. A streak of starfire fell towards Shouchen, and another streak of starfire crashed towards Ding Ning. The power of these two sparks was strangely terrifying, and it was hard to tell which was stronger. For powerful cultivators, saving people was always harder than killing people. Also, Zheng Xia only needed to release the power he had accumulated for many years in an instant. He was not like Ding Ning, who had to consider his own survival after fighting. So this battle was not equal from the start. But Ding Ning was not worried at all. He just shook his head with some regret and even sympathy. He responded, "Is it worth it? With your talent, you should have a chance of reaching Realm 8. Ding Ning's words should be the most authoritative in the world of cultivators. But at this time, Zheng Xia did not have the chance to think about these words, feel regret, and respond. Because when the words sounded, Ding Ning was already next to Shouchen. He did not care about the starfire aimed at him behind him. Because when he went over, a nether passageway appeared in the space behind him. The inside was filled with ice that seemed to float out of the netherlands. Zheng Xia's body crashed into this netherworld. The extremely cold ice hit the flames outside his body and gave off real popping sounds like hailstones hitting fragile window paper. Then the furious star fire outside his body became as fragile as window paper. The biting cold instantly invaded his body, causing his figure to suddenly slow down. At the same time, every bit of flesh and blood in his body began to tremble, shaking out even more heat to resist the cold. Zheng Sha's face quickly turned ashen. His eyes were filled with disappointment and shock. He understood where this cold energy came from. Zhang Sun Qinshue's 9 Hell King sword was destroyed, but Ding Ning and Zhang Sun Qinshu had dual cultivated in Chongling for more than a decade and had endured an unknown amount of this nether cold energy. Ding Ning himself was a part of the 9 Hell King sword. The furious star fire reached his head. Shouchen's hair started to burn. His skin was attacked, it cracked, and even left his body. But he did not move at all, because when Ding Ning moved, he knew he did not need to interfere in this battle. A sword light flew out of Ding Ning's hand. The moment Ding Ning's great punishment sword appeared, the life bond items of almost all the cultivators present felt so fearful they wanted to leave their bodies. This feeling caused many cultivators to fly back in shock. The great punishment sword's blade was simple and heavy, not thin or narrow. But when Ding Ning swung this sword light upwards, in everyone's perception, this sword light turned into an extremely thin line. In particular, many cultivators with higher cultivation could not help but cry out at this moment. The sword light turned into a talisman intent. Crack! The falling star in the sky and the sky above the star were cut open like a thin piece of paper. The sky being cut open was just an illusion caused by the talisman intent being too powerful. However, the star being cut open was incomparably real. The giant celestial metal that had passed through countless stars and finally landed in this world was directly cut in half. The originally stable life bond energy inside suddenly collided with each other and bounced off to the sides. Half of the sky metal fell towards the sea on one side of Blue Jade Island, and the other half fell into the forest deep in Blue Jade Island. After the two pieces of heavenly metal were separated, there were still countless strands of astral origin chi that were visible to the naked eye. Explosions were unceasingly occurring, causing countless balls of beautiful flames to explode. Ding Ning did not look at the bright colors. He calmly turned around and looked at Zheng Sha. Zheng Sha's body had completely stopped. He still maintained his forward posture, but even his feet were pierced by the ice on the ground. He barely managed to resist the invasion of the cold and did not immediately die. But his body had turned gray, like the color of the bricks on the city walls after being weathered for a long time. It is Li Tsaiqian's seal essence. He stared hard at Ding Ning's eyes and squeezed out a strange sound from his throat. Ding Ning nodded simply and said, "I saw him fight with Yuan Wu at the Deer Mountain Conference." Zheng Sha opened his mouth. There were countless emotions in his chest, and he could not help but want to curse. But looking at Ding Ning's calm gaze, he sighed in the end. "Actually, when Zheng Xiu abandoned you and chose Yuan Wu, some people in the family and I were against it. This is one of the reasons why the family was at odds with her for many years after she became the empress. I taught her many things, but she did not listen to some things. You can betray the world, but not one of your heart." Ding Ning nodded, indicating that he had heard the words clearly. Then he looked up and said calmly, "There is no meaning in saying this now." Zheng Sha smiled sadly and suddenly asked, "Where did Lin Zhujiu, Zhang Sun Qinshuo, and the others go?" Ding Ning frowned slightly. Looking at him, he asked softly, "Is there any meaning in asking this now?" Zheng Sha looked at Ding Ning and managed to say, "I can use a secret to exchange." Looking at his gaze, Ding Ning knew that this Jiaodong Commandery cultivator was still thinking about Jiaodong Commandery before he died. So Ding Ning nodded, walked next to Zheng Sha, and said a few words by his ear. Zheng Sha's body shook slightly. His knees gave off cracking sounds, unable to support the weight of his body, and knelt down. He used a voice that only Ding Ning could hear to say something. At this time, Ding Ning was very close to him. In his gradually blurring vision, Ding Ning blocked the world in front of him and grew taller. He looked at this cultivator that he had once admired and sighed inside. When he left this world, Zheng Xiu finally lost most of Jiaodong Commandery's foundation. Chapter 748. As Zhengsha sighed and died. In the Chu capital far from Jiaodong Commandery, Su Qin welcomed another new life. At some unknown time, the number 9 had become supreme. It was common knowledge that the 12 shaman god statues recorded the best yin and ghost cultivation techniques in the world. However, very few people knew that the 9th shaman god statue's cultivation technique was the most special. Most importantly, this cultivation technique allowed one to advance very quickly. Moreover, it was the only cultivation technique he could cultivate. The crystal that recorded the cultivation method had been destroyed by him, but the runes and every line in the diagram had been deeply imprinted in the depths of his mind. In the early years of Chongling, he had been one of the best among the younger generation of cultivators, but not the top. Yet, most of the young geniuses ranked above him did not have such complicated and difficult experiences as he did. From White Goat Cave, to following Li Ling Commandery, to escaping the Chu capital to Celestial Seal Sect, and then returning to the Chu capital, his experiences made him even better. Most likely, not many of the young geniuses of Chongling could compare to him. He comprehended quickly. On the way back to the Chu capital, he had completely comprehended the method recorded on the 9th shaman statue. But the transformation of vital energy needed some time. After countless rounds of breathing exercises, the vital essence in his body finally began its most important transformation. The Jade Palace in the depths of his 7 seas quietly collapsed, turning into a deep red sea of blood. The vital energy flowing through his body also started to turn red. As he breathed, there was not much of the dark and cold aura that came from cultivating yin and ghost techniques. There was no gray or black flame around him, only a faint red light. The red light clearly reflected the flow of energy behind his body. The energy that flowed out of his body, and the energy that gathered from all directions and flowed into his body were like the shadows of 1,000 arms that swayed. The difference in color did not represent the difference in the nature of the energy. This transformation caused him endless pain. The familiar vital energy presence disappeared like everything in the past had been taken away. Su Qin sensed that many places in his body had lost the vital energy that was like a spirit spring in the past, but became a vessel that could accept the death energy that he usually hated. His body became sore and sore, but he quickly sensed many auras that he couldn't normally sense. Those were the auras left behind by many creatures after they died. Even in the cracks of the mirror-like jade floor of this newly built palace, there were countless strands of such auras floating in the air. With each breath, if his mind moved, these yin energies would be easily absorbed into his body. This was completely different from the past when he needed to meditate to absorb primal energies of the universe. This kind of growth of energy in his body became simple and crude. Su Qin reached out with his left hand and sensed the yin energies in the cracks of the jade floor. He sensed the energies gathering into the shadows of arms behind him. A self-mocking and emotional smile appeared at the corners of his mouth. The bones and tendons of his left hand were twisted and looked vicious and ugly. Even though he had grasped some methods of using this hand to cast seals in Celestial Seal Sect, compared to the seal path that Zhang Yi had comprehended later, that was a minor path that was not worth mentioning. He had only lost one hand, but he had coincidentally obtained such a method. Also, this seemingly grand and newly built palace was where the Chu Imperial Palace had been burned down. Many cultivators had died in that fire, and it had provided him with enough yin energy to enter. This seemed to be the will of the heavens. He looked at his crippled left hand. He did not pull it back into his sleeve, but towards the head of the man in front of him. This was a prisoner, a famous cultivator from the Chu. He was one of the generals loyal to Zheng Xiao. In a battle after the Chu capital was taken, he had been seriously injured by the cultivators of the Qi dynasty and captured. When his left hand was about to touch this person's head, the man who seemed to be unconscious suddenly opened his eyes. Then he looked at him and said with a cold smile, "I had not thought that a Qin sword cultivator like you would change to the Qi yin ghost method. But have you thought this through? No cultivator of the yin ghost dares to kill a living person and absorb their energies to cultivate." This Chu cultivator had clearly been pretending to be unconscious. and clearly sensed the process of Su Qin's vital energy changing. What he said was the truth of the cultivation world. For cultivators of the Yin Ghost method, absorbing the energies of the Yin Ghosts in the world and killing cultivators to absorb their energies were completely different. In some stories, the energy of cultivators who had just been killed contained strong resentment and was full of curses. But in reality, even cultivators who also cultivated Yin and Ghost arts would need time to naturally transform their Yin and Ghost energies after they were killed. Time could change everything in the world, and so could energy. That is just the past, and your understanding. However, Su Qin only responded with a light sentence. Without any hesitation, his hand landed on the head of this Chu cultivator. The destructive power coming from the head easily killed this Chu cultivator, who had his energy sealed and could not resist. As he breathed, an unusual red light appeared on his left hand. Then the red light that had not been cold before started to turn dark and cold. Sinister black mist formed outside the red light, but the red light on his hand instead became more and more intense, making his left hand and this cultivator's body seem to have completely merged together. Streams of bloody energy flowed into his body. A muffled roar burst out of Su Qin's throat. Among the thousands of arms behind him, one of them suddenly solidified and turned into a terrifying bloody hand. The Chu cultivator's body fell backwards with a soft pop, as light as rotten wood. "Come in." Su Qin slowly lifted his head and softly shouted towards the outside of the hall. The terrifying bloody hand quietly disappeared behind him. The door opened. His eyes were filled with regret when he saw a pair of delicate twin sisters walking in from outside the hall. "Thank you for giving me so many beautiful memories." He looked seriously at this pair of palace attendants who had served him for many nights and said with a sigh, "I had thought that one day I could give you a good future. But just now, you accidentally gave off a presence you should not have." He shook his head and said, "I had not thought that you were King Qi's people." Chapter 749. Hearing his words, the faces of the two palace maids immediately turned pale. Few of the Qin dynasty's sword cultivators would abandon the sword and cultivate the methods of the Yin and Ghosts. One of the palace attendants was silent for a moment. She looked at him and said, "We had not expected you to do this. Because starting from the Bazin Kendo ground, all the cultivators in the world think that the life-bond sword cultivation of the Qin people is the right path. These are just methods to fight enemies. There is no right path, only cultivation speed." Su Qin smiled with slight disdain. "If we are speaking of abandoning the sword to cultivate, I had already done so when I entered Celestial Seal sect." The other palace attendant looked up at him and said softly, "I heard that swordsmen Qin are very proud." Su Qin understood her meaning and smiled unconcernedly. He also looked up. "For me, my pride is always in the future, not the past." The palace attendant who had spoken earlier took a deep breath and said, "Other than the methods recorded by the 12 shamans, there is no method in the world that can change your vital energy so quickly. So the destruction of the 12 shamans is related to you. Didn't you lurk around me to find out about this from me?" Su Qin's smile grew. "Your Qi Emperor has been completely defeated but still does not give up. He still has a thread of hope to see if I have left anything related to the 12 shamans on me. But he is already crippled. Is there any meaning in you working for him?" Hearing this, the two palace maids looked hesitant. But just as they showed hesitation, the two of them and Su Qin attacked at the same time. With a shout, a shadow that looked like a black bamboo leaf flew out of one of the palace attendant's sleeves and slashed at Su Qin's throat. The other palace attendant did not stop at all and flew backwards towards the palace door behind her. These two palace attendants were twins, and their minds were connected. If one of them escaped, they could spread the news that Su Qin had obtained a method from the 12 shamans. The hesitation on their faces was only to confuse Su Qin. Their performance was perfect, but what they got in return was Su Qin's mocking smile. "It's a pity that you still have a trace of luck. Or perhaps you were too greedy. If I had let you in, you might have been able to escape if you had directly fled. However, you still came in. Did you want to get close to me and see if I really have the cultivation method of the 12 shamans? When the first word of his sentence sounded, the black shadow, flying towards his throat, was already grabbed by a bloody hand that reached out from behind him. The techniques of the 12 shamans were the ancestors of the Yin god and ghost arts, and the technique of the 9th shaman was the beginning of the ancestors. With a soft pop, the powerful black shadow was crushed into a ball of soft black mist by the seemingly gelatinous bloody hand. Under the palace attendant's shocked gaze, the bloody hand that grew out of Su Qin's back slapped the top of her head. The other serving girl cried out. She knew that her sister was undoubtedly going to die, but she did not turn her head. Her long black hair left her body and wove into a black net behind her. Her body smashed heavily against the slightly open palace door in front of her and smashed outwards. But at this time, a red line appeared on her throat. When the red line appeared on her throat, she finally saw a flash of sword light. This was a very thin and light gray small sword, like the inconspicuous dust that had piled up above the door. This small sword was very ordinary and was not the best among flying swords. But this inconspicuous flying sword had been hiding at the door for a long time like a poisonous snake, and now took her life. As blood sprayed from her throat, her body fell heavily to the ground. She was less than 10 feet from the door. Blood sprayed onto the door, but she had no more strength to get closer. Su Qin did not even spend any more effort to control the flying sword. He allowed the ordinary small sword to fly diagonally and nail into the corner of the wall. Tiny drops of blood fell to the ground from the sword like flowers blooming in the dark corners of the walls. No matter how I abandon the sword, I am at least swordsman Qin. Using a flying sword to sneak attack is too simple for me. Su Qin looked at the palace attendant who had used her last strength to turn around and look at him. He looked down slightly and said, The palace made open her mouth, and a hissing sound came out of her mouth. Blood foam kept rushing out. Her throat had been completely cut off, blood and vital energy rushing out. She could not speak, but through the movement of her lips, Su Qin could see the last word she said, killing people to cultivate. You will be punished by the heavens. There is energy in life and death. What is the difference? Even the strongest cultivator is just a splash in the primal energies of the universe, a page in the history books. Su Qin looked calmly at her and responded coolly. By the time he finished speaking, the 2 palace maids who had brought him many beautiful memories were already dead. The bloody hand behind him was still pressed against the head of the palace maid he had killed first. Behind him, another bloody hand gradually took shape and was about to be born, killing some cultivators and using the energy converted between life and death to form a bloody hand that could move at will. This kind of cultivation was too simple. Even if one's vital energy cultivation was temporarily stagnant and could not reach Realm 7, one could form 1,000 hands according to this method. Also, the power of these 1,000 hands would grow as one's vital energy cultivation grew, like an enormous formation. Anything in large quantities would cause a qualitative change. For Su Qin, he did not need much time. It was not impossible for him to challenge experts above his realm. For cultivators, nothing was more pleasurable than an increase in power, especially this kind of rapid increase in power. It was intoxicating. Even Su Qin, who had experienced many ups and downs, could not help but indulge in this feeling. He was so happy he wanted to moan, but in a few breaths, his body suddenly froze. A powerful terror rose from the bottom of his heart. The bloody hand behind him furiously retreated into his body. His body flew backwards. Amidst the sound of his body breaking through the air as he flew, the palace door was silently pushed open. The black-robed Chi Siren's figure appeared beside the corpse of the palace maid. His indifferent and cold voice rang out. Do you think you can escape? Seeing the person in front of him was the Chi cultivator he did not want to face the most, Su Qin's eyes grew cold. The fingers of his crippled left hand in his sleeve suddenly twisted and moved furiously. Chi Siren just stood at the door to the hall. With his hands behind his back, he glanced at Su Qin. The roof of the hall turned black. The black energy was as thick as ink and then dripped down like liquid. Chapter 750. Chi Siren was very calm. Even in the heavily guarded and newly built Chu Palace, guarded by many Qin dynasty cultivators, he was still leisurely, as though he was looking at the scenery. Because this was reality. In the entire Chu capital, there was no cultivator who surpassed him. Every drop of black liquid falling from the ceiling turned into a black poisonous snake. Hundreds of black poisonous snakes danced in the air, faster than Su Qin's retreating speed. But strangely, they did not make any sound, and even absorbed all the vibrations in the hall, including the ripples in the air. The hall became absolutely silent, as if the flow of time had slowed down. In Chi Siren's vision, Su Qin seemed to have stopped in the air, and those black poisonous snakes slowly approached Su Qin. At this moment, a hint of surprise appeared in his eyes, like a ripple in a tranquil pond. The sleeve of Su Qin's left hand swelled wildly. At this moment, countless crimson talismans shot out from the sleeve. The dense seal paper sprayed out like a fountain, so dense it was like water. In the next moment, the power contained in these seal papers was ignited by Su Qin's vital energy. The bursting power collided, causing the energy coming out of the seal papers to be even faster and fiercer. This was a very shocking scene. The entire hall was filled with seal papers. If one did not see it with their own eyes, no one would have thought that a cultivator could carry so many seal papers with him and activate all of them in an instant. The yuan qi in the entire palace was torn into countless fragments by the power of these talismans. These fragments spun rapidly like sharp tiles, cutting the bodies of the hundreds of black poisonous snakes, cutting them into black fragments. Chi Siren stood in this chaotic storm. He was slightly surprised. While he did not want to kill Su Qin directly, especially after confirming that the other had obtained a powerful secret art from the 12 shamans, he had not thought that the other would be able to continue moving under his attack. The power of these talismans was not strong for him, but quantitative change led to qualitative change. Each of these talismans must have been made by Su Qin himself, so he could activate them so familiarly in an instant. Even the simplest seal needed a certain amount of time to make. How much time had it taken Su Qin to make so many seal papers? What people thought of as geniuses was usually related to hard work. Coming from a cultivation place like White Goat Cave, and then leaving your home, I do admire you for being able to reach your present accomplishments so quickly. He took a step forward and said to Su Qin. His tone was sincere and truly admiring, but this did not mean that he would hold back. When he took a step forward, the air in front of him shook. The chaotic power in the air, including the seal papers that had not dissipated, were all compressed into a tide that pressed down on Su Qin. Su Qin's face was as white as snow. He felt the real threat of death. A shout came from his lips. Behind him, a complete bloody hand and a nearly formed bloody hand slapped forward. There was an explosion. The two bloody hands exploded into a rain of blood. His body hit the wall behind him, and he vomited blood. Amidst the smoke and dust, the wall that he crashed into was covered with spiderweb-like cracks. Then it exploded, and his body continued to fly backwards along with countless broken bricks. Chi Siren frowned as he looked at the large hole in the wall and Su Qin, who had escaped into the darkness behind the smoke. The power of the two bloody hands and the strange energy they contained made him feel uncomfortable. Gasps and shouts sounded outside the hall. The cultivators and soldiers guarding the Chu Palace had all been alarmed. Chi Siren had not expected to be able to escape the hall. He started to understand why the Qi Emperor had such unique instincts, and why his last order before abdicating was for the cultivators of the Qi dynasty to kill this young Qin cultivator at all costs. Black energy surged out from under Chi Siren's feet and wrapped around his body. He merged into the darkness outside the hall. In the next breath, he was outside the hall, floating in the air. Two streams of black energy turned into bat-like wings that flapped at his sides. Su Qin, who was flying through the air, was shocked to see that Chi Siren was not far from him. Chi Siren looked coolly at Su Qin, his right hand balled into a fist. An enormous black hand silently formed in the air behind Su Qin and gripped Su Qin's body. There was a sharp sound of tearing through the air. Dozens of flying swords were the first to arrive, cutting into the enormous black hand. But in a moment, their light dimmed. The swords were covered in rust, and the sword energies could not penetrate deeply. Su Qin gave a shrill howl, his body rising several dozen feet higher. In his right hand, dozens of bright flames fell to the ground like burning phoenix tails. The ground of this newly built Chu palace was suddenly covered with golden runes, and the blazing rays of light turned into a golden curtain of light that soared into the sky. The sound of a phoenix rang through the sky from the curtain of light. The enormous black hand was cut into pieces by the golden curtain of light, turning into pungent smoke. You have even grasped the phoenix cry formation of the Chu palace. What else do you have that surprises me? Chi Siren took a deep breath. After Yin Ying's death, he was the strongest cultivator of the Qi dynasty. He had his pride. His repeated attacks had been defeated by a junior like this. Even if the other had the core of the formation of the palace, he still felt a hint of anger after his repeated failures. His figure disappeared. In front of everyone's eyes, his body turned into a thin black energy in the air and disappeared without a trace. Yet Su Qin's figure suddenly froze. A dark and cold presence landed behind his head. Chi Siren's figure appeared in his shadow, and his hand pressed against the back of his head. Crack, crack, crack. A string of explosions came from his spine. His spine was the first to be shaken loose. His body was held softly in Chi Siren's hand like a snake. In the next moment, dark and cold energy charged into his energy sea. Chi Siren's vital chi was like a cold stone that settled down in the depths of his chi sea. At this moment, several majestic forces rushed towards Chi Siren from all directions. This kind of power did not care about Su Qin's life or death. Clearly, it was a Qin cultivator that Zheng Xiu or Su Fu had sent here. For them, Su Qin was just a puppet on the surface. Chi Siren shook his sleeve, and dozens of bone artifacts flew out of his body. Blood seeped out of the corner of his mouth. But at the same time, his body had broken free from the combined attacks of multiple grandmasters. Holding Su Qin, he rose hundreds of feet in an instant. Then, with a muffled boom, his body seemed to split apart, turning into several black clouds that flew in all directions. Chapter 751. Another mouthful of blood came out of Chi Siren's mouth and flowed out of the corners of his mouth. Immediately, it turned into two streams of tangible black energy like two vicious fangs. Forcefully casting a spell to escape after resisting multiple grandmasters had caused considerable damage to his body. For a Realm 7 grandmaster, internal damage could affect their lifespan. Qi cultivators who cultivated Yin and Ghost methods had shorter lifespans than cultivators who cultivated other methods. But Chi Siren did not care about this. How long one lived was not important. What was important was whether one could burn one's life to the fullest. He had originally come on the Qi Emperor's mission to eliminate this young opponent who made the Qi Emperor feel uneasy. Yet the other had brought out a supreme method from the Witch God Temple. This gave him endless possibilities in the future. Su Qin's face was extremely dim. His eyes were filled with the aura of death. Only a strange crystal light surged out from the depths of his eyes. It seemed that the sealed energy had solidified into some kind of crystal, and that crystal light shone out from his eyes. No one could keep up with Chi Siren. Chi Siren and his true figure moved stealthily through the night in a completely different direction from the fleeing black clouds. But if someone was next to him and Chi Siren, they would sympathize with Su Qin's following encounter. In terms of killing, cultivators who cultivated Yin and Ghost methods might not be as fast and clean as Swordman Qin. But in terms of torture of the soul and energy, the grandmasters of the Qi dynasty had countless strange methods. Some cultivators, in their hands, could become something neither human nor ghost. They did not even know what they were. Chi Siren believed that Su Qin knew this, but he knew that Su Qin would not be satisfied. So he felt that he had to remind Su Qin of this. When his figure passed through the prosperous streets of the Chu capital, through the wilderness, and reached the graves of the former nobles of the Chu capital, he stopped. After the fall of the Chu capital, most of the nobles of the Chu capital no longer existed. This graveyard had been dug up by the refugees and became a playground for stray dogs. The bones of the famous figures of the Chu capital's history were scattered everywhere. Only the fragments of the coffins and some fragments of exquisite clothing that had not yet decayed could make people think that these skeletons were different from ordinary people. 100 years later, the nobles, generals, and ministers would all return to the earth. Chi Siren smiled mockingly. He turned to look at the immobile Su Qin and said, "You should understand that after being captured by Grandmaster Qi, the most tragic fate is not to be killed, but to become a material in his hands. Even death cannot free you." Strictly speaking, I'm already a cultivator who cultivates Yin and ghost methods, so I naturally understand. Su Qin looked at him and said. The energy in his body could not circulate. When he spoke, he had to rely on the vibrations of his vocal cords. His voice was extremely strange. But to Chi Siren's surprise, his tone was still very calm, with an indescribable viciousness. You want to say that if I teach you the method of the shaman god, you'll give me a quick death? However, how can everything in this world go according to one's wishes? If you really want to use that kind of method on me and imprison my spirit forever in a body that is neither dead nor alive, then let's just continue like this. I will forever be in hell, and you will never be able to obtain this cultivation method. Chi Siren was not angry. He looked silently at Su Qin for a moment, and finally understood why the Qi Emperor had such an intuition. Some people were ruthless to others, but Su Qin was the kind of person who was ruthless to himself. Such a person, even if he was forever in hell, would carry a viciousness and believe that he would one day be able to turn things around. Such a person was not crazy, but a true madman. Maybe we have the possibility of working together? He was silent, but Su Qin's voice sounded again and took the initiative. I have the shaman god art and the support of the Qin dynasty's military. You are the strongest cultivator of the Qi dynasty. After Yining, you should be the leader in the hearts of many Qi cultivators. If you are together with me, what do you think the possibilities are? Maybe we can build a dynasty. After a pause, Su Qin's strange voice sounded again. A dynasty stronger than the present Shu and Qi dynasties. We may even have a chance to defeat Yuanwu and Bazinkindo ground. There is no such possibility. Chi Siren calmly shook his head in this strange and alluring voice. He slowly and clearly said, some people can become leaders not just because of their cultivation. Su Qin perceptively closed his mouth. Some people could stand at the top because of their stubborn pride. At this moment, a strange light lit up in the depths of Chi Siren's eyes. He sensed a powerful presence approaching this graveyard. Any Qi cultivator who cultivated Yin and ghost-like places where Yin energy gathered that ordinary people did not like. After a long and unique cultivation, a grandmaster like him could absorb some beneficial primal energies of the universe from such places as he breathed. So it was not strange to guess that he would pass by such a place. The key was what kind of person had come so quickly and who dared to come. He was certain that after that moment of fighting in the New Chu Palace, those grandmasters knew the difference between them. They would not dare to split up and chase after him, and would not dare to appear in front of him alone. In his knowledge, there was no cultivator in the Chu capital who dared to face him alone. He felt curious. A young woman's figure appeared in his sight. The reason he called her a young woman was not because of her age, but her figure. In the darkness, this woman who walked over the grass at the edge of the graveyard was very small. Her hair was very short, as though she had once had short hair like a man. Now, she had not kept her hair long, so it only reached her ears. However, as the woman approached, the oppressive aura in his perception grew stronger and stronger. It was so strong that even his eyes were filled with shock. The grass started to burn. The tomb started to burn. The other did not disguise her presence. The temperature of the flames could not compare to the temperature of the energy around her. Looking at the woman's quiet but wild face in the light, Chi Siren's expression grew solemn. He nodded slightly and said, "Fourth Mr. Zhao of the Zhao sword furnace?" The young woman who gave off the presence of a furnace returned the greeting. "Fourth Mr. Zhao, what do you mean?" Chi Siren asked. "Bai Shanshui is not here. She asked me to look after the Chu capital." Fourth Mr. Zhao Miao responded without changing expression. Chapter 752. Chi Siren frowned. He looked at this legendary woman and said coolly, "The Qi dynasty has a new emperor. Theoretically, we are not enemies. Maybe we will have a common enemy in the future, but the matters between allies are divided. We may not understand the matters of the Qi dynasty." Zhao Miao looked disdainfully at Chi Siren and then at Su Qin next to him. She said, "At least right now, I cannot let him land in your hands or Zheng Xiu's hands." Chi Siren took a deep breath. He stopped moving and said, "I have always wanted to experience the great moves of the Zhao sword hut. This situation is fair." He was one of the strongest cultivators of the Qi dynasty right now. He knew that this battle was unavoidable and did not waste time. Everyone in the world knew that fourth Mr. Zhao had lost his life-bond sword on the Wei River outside Chongling. Just now, he had fought fiercely and used up a lot of energy. Adding on his serious injuries, the two sides fought fairly in his view. He thought so, but Zhao Miao did not think so. While she had lost her life-bond sword, she had her own comprehension and her cultivation had increased. The Zhao sword hut never took advantage of others in a sword fight, so she just raised an eyebrow and looked at Chi Siren. "Mister, please." Chi Siren looked at her proud eyes and understood what she meant. However, he didn't argue and only nodded slightly. With a thought, a gray bone flew out from his collar. His body was covered in spirit bone pendants. To the cultivators of other dynasties, the bone ritual artifacts on his body would only make him appear savage and strange. But in reality, the inconspicuous bones on his body were all ritual artifacts that the Qi cultivators feared. Many of them were unique in the world and could not be found again. The gray bone that flew out of his collar was a finger bone that came from a strange beast in the depths of the nether abyss. After a natural but profound or coincidental transformation, the other bones of this nether beast had decayed, but this finger bone had become the center of the nether abyss. Most of the yin energy in the nether abyss had gathered in this finger bone. In the cultivation world of Daki, this finger bone was called the Dark Water Sarira. As the name implied, when Chi Siren's true essence surged into the finger bone like a volcanic eruption, this originally unremarkable gray bone released a berserk aura that made one's heart palpitate. It was as if the underworld beast had come back to life. A cloud of black chi that was several hundred feet wide appeared above the graveyard. This kind of primordial chi was even darker than the night. In the next instant, countless streams of black water started to pass through the world in front of Chi Siren. The battle between powerful cultivators paid more attention to breaking moves. The cultivators of the Zhao sword furnace, under the teachings of the Grandmaster, who was as famous as Wang Jingming, spent their years forging in front of the earth fire furnace. Day after day, they sensed the combination of fire essence and all things in the world. As they forged their own sword cores, they naturally used the fire essence of the world to the extreme. The true essence in their bodies was the world's fiercest true fire. Nether water could extinguish any fire in the world. Even if it could not completely extinguish the true fire formed by the vital energy of the Zhao sword furnace cultivators, it could greatly reduce its power. They were both Realm 7s. If Chi Siren's power was reduced, it would not be hard to deal with. Nether water was the coldest water in the world, and also the heaviest water in the world. When thousands of streams of black water appeared in the world where she and Chi Siren were, for Zhao Miao, the world around her grew heavy and cold. "Good talisman." She first gave a sincere sigh of admiration. The preciousness of this kind of talisman came from the spirit materials that could not be replicated. This power that made her feel cold to the bone was really admirable. But her next words were, "Such a pity." There was a loud boom. A burning ball of fire lit up the thousands of streams of nether water and the night sky. The scarlet light of the fire illuminated every patch of grass in the graveyard, making it impossible for Chi's siren to open his eyes. In this moment, she turned into a burning sun. Her true essence surged out of her energy sea and turned into crimson true fire. But it did not leave her body to fight against the rampaging nether water and just wrapped around her in layers. She turned into a burning ball of fire. In the next moment, she took a step forward and appeared in front of Chi's siren. The fireball smashed through the hundreds of streams of water in front of Chi's siren. The crimson true fire and the black nether water collided. But there was no sizzling sound like water and fire meeting, but the clear sound of ice crystals breaking. Amidst these crisp sounds, there was an even crisper sword hum. For cultivators, this sound could be described as clean and pure. Chi's siren furrowed his brows deeply. In the light of the fire, the wrinkles on his forehead were as clear as knives. Zhao Miao held a crystal sword in her hand. This crystal sword was made from true fire and was brighter than all the red gems in the world. But what Chi's siren could not understand was that this crystal sword had a strong life bond presence. Zhao Miao's life bond sword had been lost on the Wei River. This crystal sword only had the shape of a sword and did not have a tangible sword nucleus. It should be the remnant of her life bond energy in her energy sea, like the remnant soul of her life bond sword. Based on the cultivation principles of the world of cultivators, the power of this crystal sword could not be compared to a true life bond sword. But in Chi's siren's perception, this crystal sword seemed to have been injected with something new and was extremely powerful in his perception. Also clear was that the sword essence of this sword was indomitable and had no intention of looking back. In other words, Zhao Miao was putting all of her hopes into this sword. She only wanted to use this sword to decide victory with this sword. The time these thoughts flashed through Chi's siren's mind was equivalent to the flickering of the light. The light was too blinding. He still could not open his eyes, but he still stood at his original spot and did not take a step back. Only a grandmaster like him understood that when fighting with a sword like the Zhao sword furnace that only attacked and did not retreat, the moment he retreated, his presence would dissipate, and he would not have a chance to win. His hand naturally fell to the side of his waist. There were many spirit bone ritual artifacts hanging from his waist. What he was holding was an artifact made from a long, hollow leg bone. This leg bone came from an extinct giant bird, the wind roc. This kind of giant bird was the progenitor of summoning the astral winds of the 9 heavens. Many cultivators in the world used wind arts because of their research and comprehension of its power. This leg bone was also only a small piece, but it was still 3 feet long. When he held this magic artifact in his hand, the true essence in his chi sea, as well as some of the chi that he had not used for countless years, crazily rushed out and poured into this magic artifact. Inside this ritual artifact, countless tiny blue energy whirlpools formed. Chi's siren gripped this leg bone and stabbed towards Zhao Miao's sword. More accurately, he was trying to trap it. This hollow leg bone turned into a scabbard in his hand and was sheathed on his sword. You're tuning into the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.